What happens the moment a mother's money thinks it can outvote mathematics? The bell hadn't rung yet, but anticipation already hummed through room 214 at Riverside High. Mr. Elijah Monroe, 15 years deep into chalk dust and second chances, finished the last line of a quadratic proof, the white of the board glimmering under fluorescent light. He set the chalk down, the way a violinist sets down a bow after a final, lingering note. "Before I hand your test back," he said, tapping the stack on his desk into a perfect rectangle, "a reminder, a grade doesn't define you. What defines you is what you do next." In the front row, Amir Jackson, thin, focused, his paperback textbook taped at the spine, sat straighter. Behind him, Preston Langford, all designer hoodie and watch that flashed like a dare, spun a high-end pen between his fingers as if solving problems required chrome. Elijah moved through the aisles, placing papers face down, a quiet ceremony one by one. When Amir turned his careful fingers paused, his mouth parted into a small, disbelieving smile. 98. He hid it the way some people hide treasure, close to the chest, eyes bright with a victory won the long way. Preston glanced at his own, then let out a breath that was almost a scoff. 82. Not failure, but not the story his family was used to telling about him. The paper creased under his grip. "Amir," Elijah said, voice warm, "would you mind sharing how you prepared?" Amir adjusted his glasses. "On the bus, after my shift at the grocery store, sometimes while my little sister quizzed me, while I made dinner." He shrugged, embarrassed by his own persistence. "I just, kept going." Elijah nodded. Consistency beats intensity when it comes to mastery. He was about to call on another student when the classroom door flung open hard enough to rattle the stopper. A woman stood framed in the doorway like a verdict. Genevieve Langford, Riverside's quiet rumor of inherited money and louder rumor of influence, wore a winter white suit that said boardroom even in a hallway. The handbag on her wrist could have paid this school's electricity for a month. Preston paled. "Mom, Mr. Monroe," Genevieve said, voice cool as the lobby of a museum. "A word." Elijah checked the clock. "Mrs. Langford, I'm teaching. I can see you during my planning period at—" "Now." She stepped inside. Her heels made the linoleum click like a metronome. "My son just texted me his grade." A hush fell so absolute that even the humming lights seemed to listen. Elijah kept his posture, the one he'd learned the hard way in his first years. Calm, present, unyielding. "We discuss grades privately to protect students' dignity." "Oh, I think dignity is exactly what we're discussing." Her gaze slid, cool, appraising, past Amir, as if he were furniture and not a boy who'd clawed his way to understanding. "You gave my son an 82. Meanwhile, someone else got the highest score." 30 pairs of eyes flicked from mother to teacher. Amir stared straight ahead, jaw tight. "Mrs. Langford," Elijah said, "every point on every page is earned, no exceptions." She gave a small, incredulous laugh. "Is that what you tell yourself when you decide which children deserve excellence?" Elijah felt heat prickle the base of his neck and remembered the steadier voice that lived under anger. Ruth Ellison, his own high school mentor, leaning across a chipped desk. "Excellence knows no owner, Eli. It belongs to the work." "The bell rings in 2 minutes," he said. "We can continue with the principal present." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "You'll want more than a principal. Charles is on the school board. You remember my husband." A ripple of recognition passed through the room. The Langford name opened doors in this city. It also decided which ones were locked. The bell finally released the class from the moment. Nobody moved. Elijah straightened. "Class dismissed. Section 4.3 for tomorrow." Chairs scraped, papers rustled. Preston lurched to the door without looking at anyone. His test, crumpled, remained on the desk like a dropped mask. Amir hesitated, then stepped close. "Mr. Monroe," he whispered, I earned it, right?" Elijah met his eyes. "You did the work. That's the whole story." When the last student left, the room felt like a tide had gone out and left everything exposed. Elijah smoothed the wrinkled corner of Preston's paper. He'd been here before. Not with this mother, not with this boy, but with this storm. the squall that rises when truth collides with entitlement. He gathered evidence the way a mathematician gathers lemmas, quietly, carefully. He slid Preston's and Amir's tests into a folder, along with the rubric he'd built over years. At the bottom of the drawer lay a framed photo. Him and Ms. Ellison on graduation day, her hand on his shoulder, a message scribbled on the back. Make the room fair, even when the hallway isn't. The hallways decided to be loud about it. By lunch, the incident had traveled faster than rumors usually do. It had choreography now. Students reenacting the door swing, the voice, the hush. 3 different versions had already hit social media. One grainy clip, filmed through the small window of the classroom door, showed Genevieve stepping in, chin high. Comments poured in like rain. Some defended her, some defended him. Most were hungry for a showdown. In the teacher's lounge, Principal Naomi Hale stopped beside Elijah's table. I heard. I asked her to come back during my planning block. And she said, now, Naomi finished, sinking into the chair. She'd taught chemistry for a decade before trading her lab coat for office keys. She recognized combustible elements when she saw them. I'll schedule a formal conference. And Elijah, document everything. He slid the folder across. Already started. Naomi opened it. Rubrics, answer keys, anonymized exemplars of full credit solutions with every algebraic step aligned like tiny soldiers. This is bulletproof. Truth usually is, Elijah said. It's just slow. Naomi's phone buzzed. She scanned the screen, exhaled through her nose. Make that slower. Genevieve just requested an emergency evening listening session with parents. Tribunal, you mean? Tomato. Naomi's smile was humorless. Eat something. You're about to need energy. Across town, the Langford estate rose out of old oak and new stone, the kind of place where windows look like opinions. Charles Langford loosened his tie in his office, staring at the text from Genevieve. We have a problem. Your teacher friend embarrassed Preston. He'd met Elijah exactly once. A district workshop where the teacher with the gentle baritone and ruthless data had presented on equitable grading. Charles hadn't forgotten that presentation, or the way a few board members had privately rolled their eyes at words like rubric, transparency, and step reasoning. Preston appeared at the doorway. Hey! Charles studied his son. Not the watch or the hoodie, the boy. You okay? It was humiliating, Preston said, swallowing. Everyone's talking, Mom. He stopped, guilt flashing quick and real. I mean, she was just defending me. Were you defended from a mistake or from a mirror? Charles asked softly. Did you study the way you could have? Preston's silence was the truest thing he'd said all day. Charles patted the sofa cushion. Preston sat. For a moment, there was no estate, no board seat, no last name with downtown plaques, only a father and a son in a room where truth had politely asked to be let in. I don't care if you get an 82, Charles said. I care if it's honest. On the east side, in an apartment whose curtains had learned to do double duty as insulation, Denise Jackson slid a casserole into the oven and checked the clock. Double shift in 3 hours. Nia, 12 and curious about everything, spread her homework like maps on the table. Amir came in with a soft knock. Hey, Mama. She dried her hands on a dish towel and, as always, looked at his face before his clothes, his eyes before his grades. How'd it go? He set the test down, as if laying down a fragile truth. Denise didn't whoop, though part of her wanted to. She touched the 98 with the kind of reverence some people reserve for diplomas and baby pictures. You built this, she said, one late night at a time. Amir hesitated. Mrs. Langford. She came to class. She said some things without saying them. Denise's jaw set the way it had the day the rent went up. People can borrow their power from money, baby. You don't have to borrow yours from anyone. He nodded and something fierce rooted deeper in him. The listening session wasn't on any calendar, but the room filled anyway. Riverside parents, some still in scrubs, some in suits, some in t-shirts dusted with drywall, took plastic chairs and measured one another across the aisle, where privilege often sits like a ghost. Naomi opened. We're here to listen, not to litigate. Mrs. Langford requested, Genevieve stood without being invited. Her smile had precision. Thank you, Principal Hale. I'm here because I believe in standards. She let the words stand tall. My son has consistently earned top marks in math. Today he received an 82, while another student, who I'm sure worked hard, received the highest grade. When I sought clarification, I was dismissed. It was my class time, Elijah said, calm as a level. I offered a private meeting. Genevieve's gaze sharpened. My concern is that private conversations can hide private biases. A murmur. A throat cleared. In the back, a hand rose. Mr. Chen, an engineer with a resting face of skepticism, stood. As long as we're talking about standards, perhaps Mr. Monroe could explain his. Naomi nodded at Elijah. He walked to the whiteboard, wrote out 2 versions of the same problem. One meticulous, each step justified, one sprinting toward an answer, skipping the spine of the work. Grading for process isn't charity, he said. It's mathematics. We don't reward lucky guesses. We reward understanding. Mr. Chen leaned forward, eyes narrowing the way they do when an equation starts to make sense. The first one demonstrates mastery. The second arrives but doesn't travel. He looked back at Genevieve. If my junior engineers show me number 2, I don't sign the bridge. A ripple. Chuckle here. Quick nods there. A few arms folding tighter. Genevieve's mouth thinned. Are you displaying my son's paper to humiliate him? These are anonymized examples, Elijah said. I won't humiliate any child in this school. Not yours, not mine. Not the ones who think they're invisible because their backpacks don't match their shoes. Denise stood, still in her diner polo. My boy studies on the bus, during his lunch, after work. He earned that number fair and square. A low chorus of agreement rose, roughened by warehouse shifts and softened by bedtime stories. In the aisle, a father in a blazer cleared his throat. We're not here to pit children against each other. No, Elijah said. We're here to protect all of them from the idea that excellence is something you buy. Silence settled, heavy with choosing. From the doorway, a new voice. He's right. Heads turned. Charles Langford, tie loosened, folder in hand, stepped in. Genevieve blinked, surprise cracking her composure. As a board member, he said, I've reviewed Mr. Monroe's materials. They're consistent, transparent, and aligned with district policy. He paused, letting the words land. As a father, I want my son to learn that truth is not a variable. Shock isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the way a room forgets to breathe. Genevieve's smile cooled into something else. You're undermining me in public? I'm supporting our son in public, Charles replied. Then to Elijah. Thank you for teaching math and for teaching the parts of it that don't fit on a line. Naomi brought the meeting home like a pilot through crosswinds. We'll conclude for tonight. Formal conferences will follow. Chairs scraped, people filed, conversations collided, softened, separated. Denise squeezed Elijah's arm in passing. Room's fair, she murmured. Hallways will catch up. When the room emptied, Elijah stayed, erasing ghostly chalk and the last trace of 2 solutions that had said more than anyone planned to hear. His phone buzzed. An email, subject line clean and sharp. Request for meeting, school board. Another, anonymous tip, grade adjustments last spring. He stared at the screen until his reflection blurred. On his way out, he paused by the trophy case. Most of the plaques inside belonged to sports teams. Tucked behind a soccer cup was a smaller one from a city math league, 10 years back. He remembered those kids, the ones who'd learned to be dangerous with ideas. He remembered Ms. Ellison's handwriting on a post-it he kept taped inside his desk. Make it fair, even when it isn't safe. Outside, night pressed cold against the glass as he stepped into the parking lot. Across the street, a news van idled. A reporter rehearsed a stand-up about alleged bias and concerned parents. Elijah unlocked his car, slid in, and sat a moment with hands on the wheel and jaw unclenched, the way marathoners sit before the gun, knowing the race is long and the first mile is a liar. He drove home through a city that kept its secrets in gated communities and under train trestles. At a stoplight, his phone lit again. A text from Maya, his daughter. Coach moved practice. Mom saved you the last slice. Come home. He smiled despite the day. When he stepped into the warmth of his living room, Asha, his wife, took one look at him and opened her arms. He folded in. The room smelled like roasted garlic and lemon and the promise of ordinary things. "How bad?" she murmured. "Bad enough to matter," he said into her hair. "Good enough to be worth it." Maya patted in wearing socks with tiny planets. "Did you win?" "Baby," Asha said. "It's not that kind of fight." Elijah glanced toward the briefcase on the floor, where the anonymous tip waited like a fuse. It might become exactly that kind. Later, while the house exhaled into sleep, he set a legal pad on the dining table and wrote 3 headings: evidence, process, protection. Under protection, he wrote 2 names, Amir J. and Preston L. He circled them both until the ink bled into small dark suns. Lightning flared far off, so distant it made no sound. Storms announced themselves, he thought. This one already had. Elijah closed the folder, turned off the light, and left the room to its quiet. In the dark, the chalked words he'd wiped away in room 214 seemed to glow in his mind, like equations written on the inside of the skull. Not just numbers, maps. Not just answers, routes. Tomorrow the hallway would test whether the room could stay fair. He intended to make sure it did. What if the truth you defend in daylight returns at night carrying proof? Elijah woke before dawn to the soft patter of rain on the window and the glow of his phone on the nightstand. Asha stirred and asked if it was school again. He said yes and sat up. The subject line he had fallen asleep thinking about waited at the top of his inbox like a held breath. Anonymous tip regarding grade adjustments last spring. He walked to the kitchen, set water to boil for coffee, and opened the message at the table where permission slips and quiet hopes often shared space. The note was brief and careful, typed by someone who feared being recognized. Check the math grade change log for term 3 last year. Cross-reference with donation ledger dates. Start with the Peterson files. Ask it who signed in at 10:43 p.m. on May 12th using the admin account. Not everyone here is for sale. From a co-worker who still sleeps at night. He read it again, then a third time, feeling the weight of that exact minute. Peterson meant Greg Peterson, the veteran who had retired mid-year after a health scare. The email did not accuse outright. It invited him to connect dots, which can be worse, because the reader finishes the thought in their own voice. Asha appeared with her robe tied and her hair loose from sleep. She said he looked like he was grading a ghost. He told her someone had left a trail straight through a locked door. She poured coffee, told him they would bring a flashlight and a parachute, and kissed his forehead. By 7, the school was a cathedral of echoes and disinfectant. Elijah stopped at Principal Naomi Hale's office with 2 cups of coffee and a printout of the tip. Naomi read silently, her eyes sharpening at the timestamp. Only a handful of people had administrative access, she said. Herself, the registrar, the testing coordinator, and the former department chair, Peterson. She suggested they wake Ishan in IT. Down a hallway that always smelled faintly of dryer lint, the door to the server room was propped open with an old keyboard. Ishan Patel glanced up from a rack of blinking lights. Naomi asked for audit logs for Term 3 math, all sections. Ishan slid to a console and typed with the calm speed of someone who fixes other people's emergencies for a living. Timestamps poured down the screen until he filtered by date and access level. There it was, May 12th, 10:43 p.m., admin account, then 10:51 and 10:58. 3 changes in one night. Elijah asked which students. Ishan matched anonymized IDs to names. Preston Langford twice. One other student who had since graduated. Naomi asked about the machine signature. Remote login through the district portal using a board-issued token, Ishan said. Not from inside the building. The network address mapped to the Langford residence. Silence settled, as exact and heavy as a number you cannot ignore. Naomi found her voice first. They would proceed by the book. Notify legal, safeguard student data, teach as if the room were steady while the hallway tried to sway it. Elijah nodded. He thought of Amir lifting the paper with the 98 like it might break. He thought of Preston crushing the 82 like it could bleed. He said he was not here to win, but to be right. Naomi answered that sometimes being right is what winning looks like. Second period returned his room to the relief of mathematics. Completing the square took over the board and the air. He walked the aisles, pausing to praise a careful line of reasoning, a clean justification, a correction caught in time. Preston kept his shoulders down and his eyes on the page with an attention that looked honest. When Elijah crouched beside him, the boy's voice came low and unpolished. If I rewrite the quadratic like this, does the vertex become easy to see? He had checked the text, tried, failed, tried again. Process had found its footing. Elijah said the vertex was not only visible but earned. Preston nodded, a small release in his jaw. Amir worked with the patience of someone translating a language he had learned on buses and in kitchens. When the bell rang, he packed slowly, turned to Preston, and offered to go over problem 12 at lunch. Pride flickered in Preston's eyes and then, to his credit, stepped aside. He accepted. They left together, both a little awkward, both moving in the direction of effort. By midday, a new rumor moved along the hallways. A news van outside, a still image of Genevieve on the board steps, hands folded, the caption about a concerned mother. The clip reached phones before trays hit tables. In the cafeteria, Preston turned his screen face down and focused on Amir's notebook. Amir asked for a highlighter. Preston passed one over. Amir said they would fill the air with work. They bent over problem 12 and walked the steps without skipping the spine. The last bell brought meetings. Naomi had 3 messages from legal, a draft memo she already disliked, and a calendar that made the word stakeholder feel like a bruise. She also had Ashan's logs printed and signed, a copy of the district donation ledger, and a list of staff whose consciences might have pinged last spring. She told Elijah to start with Counselor Angela Reese, who had cried in her office the week after Peterson retired and had said nothing specific. Angela was arranging college brochures when they arrived. Naomi closed the door and set the logs on the desk. Angela's eyes filled at once. She whispered that she had received a late-night call from a parent who said a misunderstanding with math would be handled. When she asked who had authorized the change, an assistant tied to the board secretary told her not to be naive. The next day, a bouquet the size of a compact car appeared at her door. No card. Elijah asked if she had kept any paperwork from the delivery. She opened a drawer and produced an envelope of the kind of slips teachers save when they are not yet sure they are saving evidence. A florist receipt dated May 13th. A delivery name and hurried script. A partial card number. Naomi breathed out slowly and said it was something. They added it to the growing stack. Back in the math wing, a figure stood at Elijah's door. Charles Langford, tie loosened, eyes carrying a new kind of tired. He said he owed 2 conversations, one as a board member and one as a father. Elijah unlocked the room and waved him in. Charles took in the space, the college pennants, the class contract with every signature, the tiny photo strip of Asha and Maya held by a magnet that read, "Prove it." As a board member, Charles said he knew what his wife was doing and that he had not authorized it. He was retrieving records from the board side, and Elijah would have them. As a father, he said Preston had asked to stay after school to study, which had not happened in years. Elijah said they could build on that. Charles nodded and slid a slim folder onto the desk. Off the record until council cleared it, he said, but a starting point. Donation schedules, after-hours access approvals, patterns that would be hard to ignore. When Charles left, the room felt as if a wall had quietly turned into a door. Elijah opened the folder. Dates, amounts, recipients. The ink told a story that no one had wanted to read aloud. A pledge on a Thursday, a grade change the following Tuesday, a gala invitation, the same 3 families trading wins at a silent auction. The last page listed special access authorizations to the grading system under the phrase testing emergency. The signatures were sets of initials. One set matched the florist slip from Angela's drawer. He photographed everything, saved encrypted copies, printed a second set, and sealed it in an envelope addressed to Naomi with a note that said, to open if anything happened to him. He had a final lesson to plan and a daughter to pick up. He also had the clear sense that the story was leaving the building and heading for the evening news. At 6 minutes past 6, while Asha tossed a salad and Maya reenacted a crossover that had brought a gym to its feet, Elijah's phone buzzed with a link the whole city seemed to receive at once. The Langford Foundation defends fairness in education. The still frame caught Genevieve at a podium, expression composed, the graphic bar about alleged grading bias. He watched 20 seconds and stopped. You can drown in someone else's narrative if you forget how to breathe. A new message arrived from a number he did not recognize. She will not stop while the cameras are on. She thinks fear is an instrument. Bring everything to the board tomorrow. Bring the students too. Initials only, C.L. Charles, no longer anonymous. Elijah looked at the letters until they steadied. He told Asha that tomorrow the story would break open. She said then they would hold. He nodded and lined up in his head what holding would require. Ishan's logs, Angela's receipt, the donation ledger, Charles's folder. Rubrics, anonymized exemplars, the district policy. 3 examples from other schools that had survived storms like this. And one more thing that felt essential. The voices of the kids. What do you bring to a room where the truth has to compete with power? The morning of the board session arrived heavy with a gray sky that made the whole city feel undecided. Elijah set his briefcase on the dining table and checked the order of his materials. Audit logs printed and signed. Donation ledger excerpts with dates highlighted. The counselor's florist receipt. The folder Charles had provided. Rubrics and anonymized exemplars. District policy marked with tabs. A single page of opening remarks that fit on half a sheet because long speeches collapse when the room starts to shake. Asha poured coffee and pressed her hand over his for a moment. Maya grabbed her backpack and asked if she could come. He told her students would be in the room, but he wanted her in class where her work counted toward a future that did not revolve around microphones. She hugged him hard and promised to watch the live stream in civics. At school, the air carried the clean smell of floor wax and the charged smell of headlines. Principal Naomi Hale met him at the office door with a clipped nod. "Legal has our documentation," she said. "It is on standby. The superintendent will chair." She lowered her voice and added that the press was growing by the minute. He recognized the look in her eyes. Not fear. Calibration. The kids were ready. Amir arrived with a notebook full of problems he had solved and a handwritten statement on college rule paper about what it felt like to earn a 98 when people decided you should not have been able to. Preston arrived in a navy shirt instead of a hoodie and held himself with the careful attention of someone who had chosen a difficult path on purpose. He told Elijah he wanted to speak. Elijah asked if he was sure. Preston said he was tired of hearing his own life explained by other people. Lena and Tariq had organized a quiet line of classmates outside the auditorium doors with a petition and a promise to take turns sitting inside so seats were not hoarded. Denise Jackson slipped in on her lunch break, a clean apron folded into her tote, eyes steady. Counselor Angela Reese came with red-rimmed eyes and a folder she had labeled with a single word so small it looked like a whisper. Proof. By late afternoon, the auditorium was at capacity. The board members filed in with laptops and bottled water, and the seriousness elected bodies wear when they sense history is about to take minutes. The superintendent called the session to order and reminded those present to maintain decorum. Cameras hummed along the back wall like a row of insects. The first portion belonged to Principal Hale. She stood at the podium and refused to perform outrage. She presented enrollment numbers, policy citations, summary of the audit trail, carefully scrubbed of student identifiers. The screen behind her showed a timeline with dates and neutral labels. May 12th, remote access. May 13, floral delivery. June 2nd, donation recorded. She clicked through slides with the patience of a chemist titrating a solution. Every drop counted. Every data point found its place. The superintendent invited Elijah forward. He had practiced not looking at Genevieve, and he kept the promise. He laid his rubric on the document camera, explained the weighting of process and precision, and showed 2 anonymized paths to a solution. One arrived through steps that disclosed understanding. One arrived quickly and left no proof of thought. He reminded the room that mathematics was not a lottery and that classrooms exist to cultivate judgment. He did not raise his voice. He arranged facts until they began to reveal their own shape. Genevieve's attorney moved to the side table and adjusted his cuffs with a practiced flourish. He questioned Elijah first. Was it not true that grading could be subjective? Was it not possible that unconscious bias could skew the judgment of even the most dedicated teacher? Elijah agreed that bias is a human hazard, then explained precisely how he had built a system that reduces the space where prejudice can hide. Transparent rubrics, moderated exemplars, open office hours, tutoring logs. He did not insult the question. He showed the work. The attorney turned to Naomi. He asked whether she could guarantee the integrity of every access to the grading system in the last 5 years. Naomi said no one could guarantee a universe, then held up the logs Ishan had printed and said they could trace what mattered for the case at hand. She described the machine signatures and the token-based logins with the simplicity that honest complexity deserves. Then came voices the attorney could not dismiss without revealing how little he understood the room. Counselor Reese spoke, her hands shaking, but her words lined up. She described the phone call with the unnamed assistant and the bouquet that had followed, and produced the receipt from that day. Mr. Chen, the engineer father from the listening session, testified to what mastery looks like on a page when you cannot see the student who wrote it. A paraeducator from last year's testing window explained how special access was sometimes requested with phrases that turned out to be passwords for something else. The superintendent turned toward the audience and offered the microphone to students who had signed up in advance. Lena told the board that when she captains a team, she expects the referee to be imperfect and also expects the rules to apply to everyone. Tariq explained how tutoring had taught him that writing the middle steps made him better, even when he knew the answer in his head. Then Amir stood, adjusted the microphone down to his height, and read from his page about dignity. He said he had learned to check his work, and he did not want to check his worth against anyone's wallet. He did not look at Genevieve. He addressed the board in the room in the stream with a clarity that made the microphones feel suddenly unnecessary. Preston followed. He did not read. He spoke. He said his mother loved him, and that love had gotten tangled with fear until it behaved like control. He admitted he had accepted results he had not earned because the world made it easy for him to do so. He said Elijah's class had felt like a wall the first week and like a doorway by the third. He asked the board to fix the system that had helped him pretend. He said he would accept whatever consequences were due for the past, and he asked to be allowed to prove his future the ordinary way. Genevieve rose when given the chance. She did not look like a villain, and that made it harder and truer. She said she had only ever wanted fairness. She said her questions had been twisted. She said her family's philanthropy had been used against them. She said the public shaming had gone too far. Her attorney reminded the board that due process exists to protect the innocent and warned of defamation. A camera light brightened as if it could feed on conflict. Charles cleared his throat from the second row of the audience and requested permission to speak as a board member and as a parent. The superintendent allowed it. Charles began with a simple sentence. "We cannot build children on a crooked scaffold." He placed his folder on the lectern and presented the records he had retrieved. Not accusations, correspondence. Approvals for special access labeled as testing emergency during weeks when no exams were scheduled. Emails in which junior staff were instructed to assist with midnight login coordination. A memo that described a recurring donor stewardship call, which happened again and again, the week after certain numbers moved up. The attorney objected and called it unrelated. The superintendent overruled and said the pattern was relevant to motive and opportunity. The board counsel added that privacy protections had been maintained because student names had been redacted. The room listened to the dates lift their heads and recognize each other across months. Questions followed. A board member asked what safeguards could be implemented immediately. Naomi proposed two-factor authentication tied to individual staff credentials, a second pair of eyes for any grade change after hours, and a public-facing log of non-routine access. Ishan, invited to the table, described how quickly he could implement the first steps and what training would be required. Elijah suggested that every department publish its rubrics and process exemplars to parents and students at the start of each term, not as a defense but as an invitation. Then the superintendent asked the question that mattered for that night. Do we have sufficient confidence in Mr. Monroe's grading practices? The vote was called. AS carried the room. The board retained him with explicit affirmation and directed the superintendent to open an investigation into patterns of unauthorized influence across the last decade. The gavel sounded once. It felt like a breath nobody knew they were holding had finally been let go. The cameras pivoted to the hallway. The room exhaled into conversations. Denise found Elijah and gripped his hand in both of hers. Angela pressed the florist's slip back into her folder like a talisman that had done its work. Mr. Chen nodded once with the quiet approval reserved for proofs that stand. Ishan made a note to himself about server permissions and then made another about bringing donuts to his team tomorrow because they had done good under pressure. Elijah looked for the boys. Amir was talking to Lena and Tariq about a weekend study group that was beginning to sound like a club. Preston stood near the side aisle and kept glancing at the exit as if unsure which way to go. Elijah stepped over and asked how he was doing. Preston said he felt like someone had opened a window and the air in the room had changed. He added that his mother was going to be angry, and then he surprised himself by saying he would handle it. In the parking lot, the evening air was cool, and the news vans were still fishing for stray interviews. Elijah walked past them without stopping. His phone vibrated with messages he would read later. He drove home through streets that looked the same and felt different. At a red light, he watched pedestrians pass under a yellow street lamp and wondered how many of them had been graded fairly today and how many had not. He decided his part was to keep a room fair and to help other rooms learn how. At home, Maya met him at the door with the kind of smile that makes a hard day step back a little. Asha handed him a bowl of pasta and waited while he told the story. When he was finished, she said what she always said when the day had demanded more than he thought he had. "You kept your line." He answered that many hands had held it with him. She said that was the point. Near midnight, when the house was quiet, he returned to his notes. He added a new heading to his legal pad: repair. Under it, he wrote names of students who would need care as the investigation widened. He wrote Preston's name and circled it. He wrote the names of colleagues who would need support when old stories surfaced. He wrote a question to himself: how do we teach the adults? He put down the pen and looked at the stack of documents on the table. Evidence has weight, so does grace. Tomorrow would ask for both. He turned off the kitchen light and stood for a moment in the glow from the street before climbing the stairs. The city was still undecided. The room he guarded was not. What happens when a storm ends and the roofs you trusted start dripping in new places? Morning slid over Riverside in a pale wash that left everything looking rinsed but not yet dry. Elijah woke before his alarm, not to anxiety, but to an odd, buoyant quiet. Asha lay curled on her side, one hand beneath her cheek, the same way she slept the night before their wedding and the night before Maya was born. Those memories steadied him more than any headline could unsteady him. He eased out of bed, made coffee, and opened the front door to fetch the paper out of habit. It wasn't there. The paper had followed the rest of life into phones. He scrolled through messages without clicking any links. Colleagues had layered his notifications with short truths. "We're proud of you. The kids were incredible. Ishan is a wizard. The superintendent wasn't terrible. Parents had added their own soft chorus. Thank you for seeing our children. Thank you for explaining every step. Thank you for refusing to humiliate anyone." Inside those words were hours of fear that had finally exhaled. It made Elijah hold his mug with both hands. Maya padded into the kitchen in an oversized hoodie that used to be Elijah's. She yawned, poured cereal, and said she had watched the entire board meeting on the district stream with her civics class. The chat had been wild. She said the comments were split between people who thought fairness could be measured and people who thought it could be bought, and an entire third group who said they never knew how any of it worked until someone showed them the inside of the machine. She asked if he had been nervous. He told her he had never been more nervous and never more certain. At school, the doors felt lighter on their hinges. Naomi stood in the lobby with a stack of new ID badges for staff that would implement the first layer of two-factor authentication. Ishan had set up an enrollment station in the library with a rolling cart of label makers and a humor that sanded down panic into participation. A sign read, "Your login is more powerful than you think. Protect it like your coffee." Elijah's classroom filled with a noise he loved, the sound of teenagers retelling a story they had lived, not to gossip, but to make sense. Lena reenacted the exact tilt of the microphone before Amir adjusted it down to his height. Tariq collected signatures for a proposal to publish every department's rubric at the start of each term. Nia, who had a pass from her own class to drop off a note for her brother, stood in the doorway long enough to say she had cried when Amir said he wanted to stop checking his worth against anyone's wallet. She said she didn't know math could do that to a room. Elijah told her it wasn't math. It was people not letting math be used as a weapon. Preston came early and stayed late. The early part he used to put his notebook in order. He copied problems he had rushed the week before, this time writing every step like he was leaving breadcrumbs for a future self who might need a map. The late part he used to ask questions he had been too proud to ask before. He asked about factoring by grouping with a kind of earnestness that made Elijah feel the injustice all over again of how long the boy had been told he understood things he did not understand. Preston's understanding grew by inches, which are the only units that count. Around midday, a new email arrived from district leadership that had the tone of a memo drafted by 3 lawyers and softened by a principal. It announced the formation of an independent review panel to examine grade change practices across the last 10 years, to be chaired by a retired state judge with an affection for public education. The memo also invited teachers to submit confidential statements. It promised that the district would cover legal counsel for any staff asked to testify. It felt, for once, like an institution having the courage to look at its own reflection. The investigation started pulling on threads immediately. Someone in the superintendent's office requested logs from athletics eligibility adjustments and extended time accommodations that had been granted without a psychologist's signature. A guidance counselor from a different high school in the district sent Naomi an email that began, "I think it was the same 3 families over here," and ended with, "I am ashamed I didn't speak sooner." Naomi replied with a sentence she had borrowed from Elijah years ago. "Shame is a sign you know which way to walk. Start now." The pressure on the Langford household grew an extra layer of glare. Genevieve held a press availability outside their wrought iron gate, where she framed her efforts as advocacy for fairness and respect for parents' voices. Her words were measured, her suit a shade of navy designed to look like gravity. Reporters asked about the remote login. She referred to counsel. They asked about the bouquet. She said she had sent many gestures of appreciation to school staff over the years and couldn't track each one individually. They asked if she would resign from any school committees. She said she would not step away from a system that needed reform. Inside that same house, a different story took place. Charles sat with Preston at the kitchen island, a bowl of apples between them. He asked his son to tell him the truth in one sentence. Preston said the truth was that he had let other people define him as smart, and he had been more addicted to the label than to the learning. Charles nodded and set his phone face down. He said he would resign from the school board. Preston blinked. He asked if that was necessary. Charles said it was right. He told Preston a board member should not supervise the investigation of patterns that might implicate people he'd had dinners with. Preston nodded, which is the only way to say thank you for a father's integrity without making him cry in his own kitchen. Elijah learned of Charles's resignation from a text Naomi forwarded with a single word: move. She meant the world had moved. She meant opportunity, not advantage. He walked to his afternoon class with a spine that felt more like a column than a bridge. The study group that had started as a lunch table accident spread into something sturdier that afternoon. Lena designed a simple sign-up sheet and scheduled peer-led sessions 3 days a week in room 214. Tariq proposed a name and then deleted 3 because they sounded like clubs for kids who didn't need help. Amir suggested they call it steps because steps were what made the difference between guessing and knowing. The name stuck. A flyer went up. Steps, come show your work. Nobody would be turned away. Nobody would be mocked for showing their gaps. The rules were printed at the bottom in small type. Ask questions that help, not questions that boast. Don't talk over someone else's courage. Bring snacks when you can. Denise arrived after her shift with a bag of empanadas she'd traded for at the diner. She set them on the back table with a handwritten sign that said, "Please take 1 if you solved a problem today, and take 2 if you didn't, but tried." Elijah watched students who had never shared space share food and then share the exact language for turning a messy numerator into an elegant line. Those small trades are what reform looks like when it's not on TV. Late in the afternoon, as the sun slanted and made the whiteboard glow, a quiet knock sounded at the open door. A woman stood just outside, shoulders squared as if bracing against wind that was not there. She wore a blazer in a color that expensive catalogs call ash, and a simple string of pearls that looked like she didn't notice them anymore. It took a second for the room to understand they were looking at Genevieve Langford without cameras. Preston, who had been explaining how to complete the square on a problem that had made two sophomores groan, went still. Amir's eyes flicked to Elijah's face. Lena stood up in the way athletes do when they think they might need to catch someone or block something. Genevieve asked if she could speak to Elijah. Her voice didn't have the courtroom timbre of the last weeks. It was the voice of a person who had not slept. Elijah said yes and stepped into the hall. The door remained open by an inch. The students could hear only the hum of the building and the occasional word. She said she didn't come to argue. She said she came to apologize for stepping into his classroom the way she did and for implying that he would harm children to make a point. She said she was not asking for forgiveness. She said she would submit whatever records she had. She said she would accept whatever consequences the investigation required. Elijah listened without folding his arms and without making his face into a place for her to leave her guilt. When she finished, he told her what he could tell anyone who had heard a room and finally understood it. He said repair starts with truth, proceeds with amends, and takes much longer than anyone wants. He said repair is most visible in who we help when no cameras are around. She asked what she could do. He said she could start by attending the STEP study sessions and helping serve snacks and not talking about money while kids asked about math. She flinched. He didn't soften it. She nodded and said she would try. He said trying is invisible, showing up is. She said she understood. He believed her to the extent anyone believes a sentence on its first day in a new mouth. Back in the room, Preston exhaled a breath he had been holding since she appeared. Amir handed him a dry erase marker like a small ceremony of solidarity. Preston finished explaining the problem with a voice that steadied by the end. Lena folded the sign-up sheet and pinned it to the corkboard. Tariq opened the bag of empanadas and managed not to devour two in a row. That evening, after the building had emptied and the floors had been mopped by hands that never got press conferences, Elijah sat at his desk and wrote a list titled After the Headlines. He wrote publish rubrics by unit, not just by course. He wrote build a parent night around how grading works with demos and messy examples. He wrote create an assignment where kids explain a problem to someone at home and grade the clarity of the explanation, not the correctness of the math. He wrote bring donuts to IT. At home, the three of them ate dinner and watched a sitcom rerun as an act of rebellion against the gravitational pull of the news. Asha said her clinic had been unusually quiet, as if the city itself had decided to lower its blood pressure by 4 points. Maya did homework at the coffee table, legs tucked under her, scribbling margins thick with notes. Elijah read a chapter of a novel that had been sitting on his nightstand for a year. He fell asleep on page 27 with the book on his chest and woke to Asha laughing quietly as she slid it to the nightstand and kissed his forehead. Some storms end with thunder-like applause. Others end with a quiet, you can mistake for nothing. This one ended with a tired city going to bed earlier than usual, and a classroom that would smell tomorrow like expo markers and sweat and dignity. When he turned out the light, Elijah thought of the word step and how ordinary and holy it was. He closed his eyes on one step and intended to open them on another. What changes first, the policy or the heart? And what do you do while they race? The review panel moved with efficiency that startled a town used to committees as a way to store problems until they rotted. Judge Meredith Cole, silver hair cropped close, spoke in sentences that did not waste syllables and asked questions like someone grading an exam where bluffing was not an option. She set a schedule that alternated open hearings with closed document reviews. She made it clear that the panel's purpose was not to stew shame, but to extract patterns. She said patterns are what let people pretend accidents happened on purpose. District Legal Counsel issued subpoenas for access logs across multiple systems. Ishan delivered bundles of data with a quiet pride that only people who do invisible labor understand. Naomi collected statements from teachers who confessed to pressures and from teachers who admitted to being relieved they had somehow been skipped. Elijah submitted his clean package, then added an addendum 2 days later with the STEP schedule, as if to say the kids were not waiting for the adults to fix things to start learning better. Media attention bifurcated into two lanes. One followed the investigation with headlines that tried to avoid implying a verdict while hinting at one. The other chased human stories. A reporter asked to interview Amir and his mother. Elijah declined on their behalf and told the reporter to come to a peer tutoring session instead. The reporter did, sat on a back table, and wrote a piece that described the smell of empanadas, the exact sound of a pencil finding a mistake, and pressing the eraser just soft enough not to tear the paper, and the way a sophomore smiled when she finally factored a quadratic that had been haunting her. The story had photographs of hands instead of faces. It made readers notice the right things. Genevieve's counsel filed a preliminary complaint warning of reputational harm and requesting an injunction against the release of any more logs to the public. Judge Cole denied it with a one-page order that read like a proof. She wrote that the public interest in understanding the integrity of educational records outweighed one family's desire to manage their own narrative. The order became its own small sensation. Teachers printed it and taped it above their desks next to class schedules and calendars of assemblies they could not avoid. Charles held a press conference to announce his resignation from the board. He did not turn it into a spectacle. He spoke in 5 sentences. He said he had supported important initiatives and made mistakes. He said he was stepping down to remove any shadow of conflict. He said he would devote his time to supporting reforms as a citizen and to being a better father. He took no questions. He went home to help Preston with a stubborn geometry proof and burned grilled cheese sandwiches because he was thinking about Euclid when the pan wanted his attention. Inside the school, reform felt granular. 2-factor rolled out for all staff and then for student portals. An alert now pinged Naomi's phone when any grade change happened outside normal hours with a link to the teacher's sign-off. The registrar and the testing coordinator now had a shared log in a spiral-bound notebook that required actual ink and a specific pen kept in a drawer that squeaked. Small friction reappeared where the machine had been too smooth. People grumbled in the way people do when convenience is peeled back and accountability is laid down. Then they adjusted and discovered the thing nobody tells you about guardrails. They make it easier to drive. Elijah's classes advanced into functions and transformations. He drew parabolas with 2 quick arcs and a steady hand, then asked for volunteers to come bend them with change. He watched students use sliders on Desmos and then go back to paper to show the algebra behind the motion. He liked the way technology could make a shape dance, and he liked the way pencil could make the reason for the dance permanent. Preston got good at describing what a negative A value did to a graph. Amir got good at diagnosing when a B value was tricking people into thinking translations had happened that hadn't. Lena discovered she had a knack for turning words like compression into pictures on the board. Tariq discovered he could explain transformations to his little brother over dinner using a folded napkin. He came to class the next day with a napkin diagram that made Elijah laugh out loud and then asked Tariq if he could use it in the handout. One afternoon, after they had wrangled an especially ornery set of piecewise functions into cooperation, the door opened and the superintendent stepped in with a visitor who made the room go quiet in a new way. It was Mrs. Ruth Ellison, Elijah's Ruth, the teacher who had steadied his life at the exact moment it could have skidded into someone else's lane. She walked with a cane now and wore a cardigan in a color that made her eyes look like they still caught everything. The superintendent had found out she lived 2 towns over and had invited her to visit as part of what the district was now calling its Integrity and Practice Review. Elijah had not known. He felt his stomach do that small elevator drop that happens when the past enters through the present without knocking. Mrs. Ellison watched for 10 minutes without speaking. She watched Amir help a classmate with an absolute value function that had breakpoints in the wrong places. She watched Preston check Tariq's graph and catch a point that didn't fit. She watched Elijah circulate with a palm-flat posture that had once been hers. Then she said, in a voice that emptied 4 decades into one sentence, "You kept the room fair." Elijah swallowed and said he had been trying. She smiled and said trying was for people who didn't already do the thing. That night, he and Asha took Mrs. Ellison to dinner at a little place with mismatched chairs and a habit of serving soups in bowls the size of helmets. They told stories that made Maya laugh and made Elijah's eyes sting. Mrs. Ellison asked about the review panel, and Elijah told her about Judge Cole's blunt kindness. Mrs. Ellison said blunt kindness was the only kind that fixed anything. She told Elijah she was proud of him in a way that made the word proud feel like something earned rather than something declared like a title. When they said goodnight, she patted his cheek as if she'd just sent him into a test he was ready to ace. The investigation continued to sprout new branches. applications for extended time that had been backdated without signatures, transfer grades that had been adjusted to avoid triggering eligibility reviews, a pattern of special access logins at 3 high schools and 2 middle schools in the same cluster, always after 10 p.m., always under the umbrella of testing emergency. Judge Cole's panel began drafting interim recommendations. They included technical fixes, transparency measures, and something that felt radical only because it was so basic. A semesterly night where teachers would teach parents and guardians how grading works, with sample problems and side-by-side examples of process worth points. Elijah volunteered to pilot it. The first family rubric night felt like an experiment for which no one could fully predict the outcome. They set up stations around the cafeteria with problems and rubrics projected on screens. Students served as docents. Amir explained process points with the authority of someone who had collected them one drop at a time. Preston demonstrated how skipping steps cost him points, even when he guessed a number right. Lena coached a mother through showing a 6th grader how to explain a negative sign without rolling eyes. Tariq ran a wrong but beautiful station where they celebrated errors that revealed thinking worth credit. Denise staffed the snack table and wrote steps on napkins for parents who had never been to a school event where math wasn't a performance they were supposed to clap for at the end. Halfway through the night, Elijah noticed Genevieve standing near the back, arms folded not in anger, but in an effort to keep from shaking. She approached the wrong but beautiful station and spent a long time studying a page where a child had made a brave mess. When she left, she put $20 in the donation jar labeled Snacks for Steps and did not sign her name. Not everyone cheered. A column in the city paper argued that the district was using process points to cover for lack of rigor. Another claimed the reform was a vendetta against philanthropy. Judge Cole responded by inviting both columnists to attend a panel session and try to solve a test under the new rubrics without writing any steps. The columnists did not attend. Students who read the paper made memes that were kinder than most memes and funnier than most editorials. Meanwhile, scholarships took shape out of the air of good intention and into legal paperwork. Charles, now a private citizen with a long contact list and a slightly smaller ego, filed documents for the Merit and Integrity Fund. He structured it to be administered by a board of educators and community members, with conflict of interest bars high enough to require a pole vault. He asked Elijah to serve as an inaugural selector. Elijah agreed on the condition that the criteria be public, the application plain, and the selection meeting recorded. Charles said that was exactly why he had asked Elijah. At steps one afternoon, after they had survived a wicked pop quiz and earned cookies that tasted like victory and butter, Amir told Preston he had started looking at colleges. Preston said he had too, and that he had no idea if he could get into the places his last name had once made sure would say yes. He said he wasn't sure he wanted yeses. He couldn't believe it anymore. Amir said they would apply to the same 3 schools and not tell each other if they got in until they had both made decisions they felt proud of. Preston laughed and said that sounded like a pact. They shook hands like kids and then pretended they hadn't. On a Thursday that felt like the district had earned it, an interim report landed with a cover page that said, "The quiet part out loud." Unauthorized influence had touched grades. It had happened in clusters. It had been concentrated among families with social power and wealth. But the report also said something hopeful in a paragraph that could have been missed if you were scanning for scandal. The panel wrote that the overwhelming majority of teachers in the district graded with integrity, that most errors were fixed before report cards printed, and that small acts of refusal had saved large amounts of truth. They also wrote that the reforms already implemented had closed most of the doors that had been used as shortcuts. The report recommended that the district make the STEPS model part of its official offerings, that family rubric night occur every term, and that teachers who had faced retaliation for grading fairly receive public commendations. Naomi printed the commendation letter Elijah received and framed it in the office next to a photograph of the graduating class from 10 years ago. She said she wanted kids to see both at once, the picture that shows the people you teach for and the letter that shows the line you hold while you teach them. What does victory look like when it's not a headline, but 100 small choices you make with chalk? Competition season crept in with spring. The Regional Mathematics League scheduled its qualifying meet at a nearby college with old brick buildings and new glass wings. Riverside had not sent a team to the top bracket in years. This year they did, wearing hoodies that read, Room 214 on the back, because the PTA had asked what they wanted, and Lena said we want to wear the place, not the logo. Elijah rode the bus with the team and sat toward the front, where he could watch the row where Amir and Preston argued about whether a problem could be attacked faster, with number sense, or with algebraic formality. He listened without interrupting and smiled when they realized they were mapping the same path from opposite sides. The bus smelled like banter, pencil shavings, and the kind of nerves that sharpen rather than dull. He passed back a bag of clementines Asha had insisted he bring and laughed when someone turned a peel into the integral symbol and took a picture. At the host campus, the team spread out to designated rooms. The proctor read instructions with the exhausted kindness of someone who has read the same page for a decade. The individual round began, and paper fluttered. Elijah waited in the hallway with other coaches and pretended not to eavesdrop on debates about recursive sequences and elegant substitutions. He watched a coach from a magnet school pace and thought about how all coaching is just pacing with purpose you can't carry for the kids you love. The team round introduced a problem about a tiling pattern that made Lena grin and Tariq groan. Preston recovered a trick he'd learned 2 nights earlier from Amir about counting unseen edges by counting corners. Amir corrected a sign and turned a messy total into a tidy one, with a rightness that made his shoulders drop half an inch in relief. The room got very quiet at minute 7, and the kind of human electricity that happens when people chase the same answer transmitted itself from desk to desk without anyone naming it. Between rounds, the kids spilled onto a lawn that had been fertilized with optimism and donors' names. They ate granola bars and swapped tactics with students from other schools with the kind of generosity you can't force. Elijah emailed Naomi a quick update that included an overuse of exclamation marks and then deleted 2 of them to behave like a professional. He texted Asha 1 sentence. They're doing it. She sent back a heart and a crossed fingers emoji and then, because she is who she is, a heart plus brain emoji to indicate their order of operations. The relay round required speed without panic. Amir anchored because he had learned to be both. Preston took the middle slot because he had learned to translate other people's work into something he could run with. Lena started because she loved starting anything. The proctor called time, and the room erupted into noise that sounded more like a basketball gym than a math hall. The Riverside relay landed with the bell in the top third of the bracket, which felt like a victory nobody would understand, except the people who remembered last year's last place finish. Elijah clapped until his hands stung. Back on the bus with medals that clinked like a promise, and a list of qualifiers for state that included both Amir and Preston, the team sang along to a song nobody will admit they like, and then fell quiet all at once, the way groups do when every brain has used its sugar. Elijah rested his head against the window and watched the blur of the city they were going back to. He thought about proofs. Not the ones you write out for Euclid, but the ones you live where each day's line must follow from the day before, or the whole thing collapses. When they pulled into the Riverside lot, a small crowd waited with hand-lettered signs that looked like they'd been made by siblings and exhausted parents between shifts. Denise waved a sign that said, "Steps to State" in bubble letters. Charles stood a step back from the crowd, clapping with a restraint that looked like he was trying to balance pride with the knowledge of where he had started. Genevieve wasn't there. Elijah noticed and somehow felt relieved. Not everything needed to be public. The weeks between regionals and state turned into a pattern that felt good in the hands. School, steps, dinner, practice, sleep, repeat. Elijah watched kids who had once thought math was a mountain begin to walk switchbacks without tripping. He watched kids who had once thought they owned the mountain learn to share the trail. He watched the district's new audit alerts pop a few more times and then less, and each time he felt the same release. The system was cutting its own bad habits. That does not often happen. The independent panel issued its full report on a Tuesday that managed to be both ordinary and ceremonial. The report was long and specific. It named practices without naming students. It listed changes without pretending they were enough. Judge Cole spoke at the press conference. She said a sentence Elijah wrote down and underlined 3 times. We cannot legislate love into a system, but we can legislate fairness, and we can invite love to do the rest. That sentence was quoted on teacher Instagram for a week, and then printed and taped to Naomi's door. The board voted to adopt the panel's recommendations. They allocated funds for peer tutoring across the district, standardized the publication of rubrics, and the superintendent promised to host Family Rubric Night every term. They also created an annual Integrity and Grading Award with a stipend and asked Elijah to help design the criteria and to recuse himself the first year. He accepted because processes should not be built by people who intend to win them. At Steps the day after the vote, a ninth grader named Jaya solved her first full page without help and burst into tears that were half relief and half wonder. Lena hugged her like a teammate who knows what it means to change your own mind about what you can do. Turek tried to make a joke and then cried a little too. Preston clapped quietly with his palm against his thigh, the way he did when he was holding more feeling than he felt safe letting out. That evening, Elijah got an email from an address he didn't recognize. The subject read simply, "Apology." The body of the email began with a confession. It was from one of the assistants who had coordinated after-hours logins. He wrote that he had loved feeling powerful when powerful people needed him, and that he had told himself it was harmless. He wrote that watching the board meeting and the interim report had made him understand that harmless is what people call harm before they name it. He wrote that he had given a full statement to the panel and was looking for work outside education until he could trust himself to be in rooms where kids' lives touched his decisions. Elijah wrote back a one-line answer. "Thank you for telling the truth while it can still change something." The state competition arrived on a Saturday with clear skies that felt like the weather had decided to cooperate. The Riverside team filed into the cavernous hall, where rows of tables made an ocean and teenagers bobbed like boats. Elijah stood with the other coaches and pretended to be calm. He watched Amir enter with his pencil like a surgeon carrying a scalpel, and Preston enter with his notebook like a climber checking his rope. He thought of the day in room 214 when Genevieve had first swung the door open and the way the room had held. He thought of Ruth Ellison watching and nodding once. He thought of Asha telling him that keeping your line is a daily act disguised as a personality trait. They did not win state. They placed 7th, which in a hall of 120 teams felt like a secret the scoreboard could not capture. Amir ranked in the top 20 individuals. Preston ranked in the top 30. Lena's relay started so cleanly that 2 coaches whispered audible appreciation despite themselves. Tariq's solution for a geometry proof was wrong and beautiful in a way that made a judge write in the margin, "Loved your approach." He saved the paper and taped it above his desk. On the ride home, the bus was louder. Victory that isn't first place frees a certain kind of joy. The kids passed their medals back and forth and told each other which problems had tried to break them. Elijah reached into his bag, pulled out a stack of postcards he had pre-addressed, and passed them forward. He told the team to write one sentence to a person who had helped them do any of it. A parent, a sibling, a teacher, a friend, a custodian who let them stay after hours. He said they could sign their names or not. He said stamps were in the front pocket. He watched them write. Back at Riverside, as dusk folded the school into the kind of purple that makes brick glow, Elijah stood in the doorway of room 214 and looked at the board. Someone had written integrity plus effort equals success again, and added a small carrot with a note, "I'll consume sometimes snacks." He laughed and left it there. He turned off the lights and listened to the building breathe. Proofs in public are not like proofs on paper. They are living things that need daily care. He locked the door and headed home to people who would feed him, tease him, and send him to bed in time to do it all again. What does making it right look like when apology is the first step and not the last? By the time the dogwoods on Maple Street threw out their hesitant blooms, Riverside had settled into a rhythm that felt almost ordinary, the way a healed bone forgets the ache but remembers the weather. You could walk down Marlowe Avenue and smell espresso and engine grease and spring mulch and not know that 3 months earlier, the town had argued with itself about what fairness meant. You could drive past Riverside High and notice banners advertising the spring musical and the track meet and a new thing called Family Rubric Night. And you might think the signs were the whole story. They weren't. Stories never fit on vinyl. Elijah woke into the new rhythm without checking for storm warnings. He brewed coffee and opened his notebook to the page where he had started keeping a ledger he never intended to show anyone. At the top, he'd written repair. Beneath it, names and dates and small verbs. Called, listened, invited, declined, returned, stayed. He'd learned from Ruth Ellison that keeping track of the invisible is not a vanity project. It's how you keep going when the visible isn't enough. Steps had become a habit as familiar as the bell. The whiteboard in room 214, once a battleground for proofs and parabolas, now made room for a corner of Post-its where students pinned the thing they learned this week that surprised them. Some were small and funny. You can divide by a fraction by multiplying by its reciprocal doesn't feel real until you do it. Some were searing and ordinary. I can ask for help and not shrink. One was a drawing of a ladder, each rung labeled with an action. Read, try, check, ask, try again, sleep, eat, try. On the first Monday of May, Genevieve Langford showed up to steps at 3:18 p.m. 5 minutes before the room filled, wearing jeans and a gray sweater with the neck pushed back the way sweaters are on people who have dressed themselves while thinking about something else. She carried 2 boxes that smelled like a bakery that knew how to make butter behave. She set them on the back table and stood as if waiting for someone to certify that her presence did not tip the room back into its old axis. Elijah greeted her with the same tone he used for parents at open house. He told her the rules: students first to snacks, adults wash hands, no money talk, no hovering over a problem unless you ask, "Would you like help?" and wait for yes. She nodded like a person accepting a sentence. When the students trickled in, Amir with his careful smile and treasurer's notebook, Preston with a new backpack that wasn't a label, but had pockets that made sense, Lena with a soccer bag banging her knee in a grin, Genevieve kept her distance from the tables and sliced bars into neat squares, as if 90-degree angles might count as penance. It took exactly 12 minutes for the room to decide she could be furniture. Tariq asked her if the bars had nuts because his little sister carried an EpiPen like a talisman. Genevieve answered correctly and taped an ingredient list to the table without announcing she had done so. A freshman named Kofi spilled water on a worksheet and looked like his world had dissolved. She slid a stack of paper towels down the table and said, "Press, don't rub," without a flourish. Amir forgot to collect the attendance sheet and found it tucked beneath the donation jar labeled "Snacks for Steps," slipped there without a note. Repair is often 2 things happening at once: the person changing and the room declining to organize itself around the story of that change. The room did not forgive Genevieve. It simply kept its own purpose and let her figure out how to be useful inside it. Thursday brought the first gathering of the Merit and Integrity Fund's inaugural selection committee. They met in the public library conference room with the thin carpet and the view of the elm that looks like it's thinking. Charles arrived in a blazer without a tie and carried a folio that had been reorganized 3 times. Denise Jackson came in her diner uniform because she refused to use paid time off for meetings. She wanted it for Nia's next field trip. A sophomore English teacher named Krupa Patel joined, the one who kept a front row seat reserved for any kid who wandered in early and wanted to talk about sentences. Principal Naomi Hale sat with a pad and a pen and the attitude of a pilot taxiing onto the runway. Elijah took the chair by the whiteboard and wrote the 3 criteria at the top in big, unambiguous letters: growth, integrity, need. They began with the applications that looked easy. A boy who had lifted his GPA from 2.1 to 3.6 after discovering that writing his steps made him better at science, not just math. A girl whose attendance went from whenever to perfect when she found out that her little brother looked at the calendar and circled the days she stayed in bed and said her name out loud like it was a wish. A young man who had taken over the family's morning routine when his mother's new shift started at 4 a.m., who walked his sister to kindergarten, then ran to catch the bus, then stayed after for steps, and never told anyone he was hungry because he didn't want to get a label he couldn't peel off. Harder were the applications with edges. The student with a disciplinary record that read like a map of bad days, but who had a teacher's letter attached that sounded like the opposite of spin. He stopped lying first, then he stopped leaving, then he started learning. The girl with a 4.0 and crisp essays and a note from the school social worker that said those numbers didn't show what it cost her to keep the house together on Friday nights when her mother worked late and her uncle showed up with promises and old stories. The boy with the famous last name and a recent string of honest 88s and 92s who wrote in a cramped hand, I don't want this scholarship because I made a mess. I want it because I cleaned mine. They argued in ways that felt like care. Charles yielded twice when he noticed his instinct to anoint. Denise demanded to know whether recommendations had been ghostwritten and proposed a one-sentence check for every letter. Tell us the time the student did something when nobody was watching. Krupa read a personal statement out loud and then said, "That sentence turns. He turned." Naomi kept time and tone. Elijah listened for verbs and for the presence of work. When they finished, they had a list of 10 names and 2 alternates, and the sense that money, when it moved along the grooves of dignity, could change the shape of a year without changing the shape of a person. The district made the awards public at the Spring Achievement Ceremony. They did not do a confetti cannon. They did a slide for each student with a short, specific description that refused to turn a life into a caption. The audience clapped in the usual places and then in some unusual ones, like when the slide for a student named Grace read, "Grace learned to say, 'Can I show you my steps?' and then showed them again and again until the wrong kind of silence left the room." James Carter, Elijah's original 98, who had started all of this with his quiet excellence, sat with his arm around his mother's shoulders as if he could anchor her pride to the row and keep it from floating away. He had already decided on MIT, then decided to walk his decision back and sit with it for another week to see if there was a reason buried under the immediate reasons. He would choose MIT anyway, but he wanted the practice of not being swept by momentum. Preston stood in the same row, clapping hard for students who, 6 months earlier, would have been invisible to him at the grocery store. He had been admitted to 3 places that scared him in the right way and had learned that fear and joy often wear the same shoes. Victoria Mitchell did not attend the ceremony. She watched the live stream at her kitchen counter with the same iPad she had once used to send emails that had tried to shape a school around a son. When the scholarships were announced, she found herself crying in the undignified way that ruins mascara and makes you dab at your jawline with a dish towel. She rewound the stream to watch the slide with the boy who had been a secret parent and the one with the girl who had learned to arrive as if her own life depended on it. When it ended, she looked at her calendar and made 3 calls. One to the district volunteer office to ask about packing boxes for supplies the new policy would send to schools that had less. One to her therapist to say she was tired of the part where she talked and ready for the part where she did. One to Sarah Carter to ask if she could come by the diner to talk. She left a message that said no is an acceptable answer and meant it. The review panel concluded with a town hall in the high school gym, the kind where folding chairs and echoes conspire to turn every voice into a plea. Judge Cole stood at center court in sensible shoes and read the findings like a person who trusts the public to hear complete sentences. She said the district had been careless in its protections, and that people with power had taken advantage of that to obtain outcomes that suited them. She said most teachers had behaved with integrity and that the few who hadn't were antioxidants in a system that still needed to heal. She said the reforms were not a victory lap, they were a baseline. She handed the microphone to a panel of students and sat down. Her body language said the floor belonged to them now. Lena spoke about how rubrics had changed the way her team talked about effort. Tariq spoke about the moment a 9th grader taught him a new way to check for errors and how it felt to be glad and not threatened. A freshman named Jaya, the one who had cried over her first full page, spoke without a microphone because her voice had its own electricity. "I almost decided in 6th grade that math was a place where I was supposed to be quiet," she said. "Now I come 3 days a week to a room where people wait while I think." The gym clapped like a wave, pushing a boat up and over. After the town hall, a small crowd formed around the snack table where the PTA had laid out lemonade and an ambitious number of brownies. Charles and Elijah found themselves standing together with paper cups and the kind of ease that comes from having gotten through something without pretending it was easy. Charles said there would be noise when the first donors saw the new conflict of interest language in the fun. Elijah said the people who minded that language were the exact ones the language needed to keep out. Charles laughed, a quick flash that had less apology in it than it used to. He said he'd never been good at Brave until recently. Elijah said Brave was just honest plus movement. They toasted paper cups and grimaced because the lemonade had too much powder and not enough lemon. Summer came with all the messy mercy of teenagers allowed to sleep past alarms. Elijah taught the 3-week bridge class he loved, the one for students who had finished Algebra 1 by the skin of their erasers and were trying to enter geometry without losing their nerve. The class had more drawing than most math rooms, more scissors and tape, more walking around with string to find loci. One morning he flipped the usual order and started with proof before they had names for things, handing out sets of statements and asking pairs to decide what could follow from what, just by thinking. A boy who had been silent for 4 days said, "If that's true and that's true, then this has to be true or nothing works," and looked up like he'd found a wormhole behind the couch. Elijah wrote the sentence on the board exactly as said, with the comma splice and the has to, then wrote beneath it the formal version with arrows and symbols. He said both were math. One was a map, one was a trailblaze. He meant for the boy to hear he wasn't visiting from another language. He was already fluent in the thinking. On the second Thursday, while he was kneeling to tape a piece of string to the floor for a demonstration and asking a girl named Nyla whether she thought a perpendicular bisector felt more like a rule or a promise, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from Naomi. "Quick heads up, district is naming you to the Integrity and Grading Award Committee and also giving you the first one at convocation." Elijah winced. He texted back one word, "No." Naomi responded with 2. "Nice try." Asha laughed when he told her. "Take the plaque," she said, "and turn the podium into a mirror." He blinked. She added, "Use the microphone to make other voices louder." Convocation was in the auditorium where the board meeting had once felt like a verdict. Now the room felt like a staff room scaled up. People in dresses and polos and cardigans and comfortable shoes huddled in little knots of nervous friendship and summer stories. The superintendent made brief remarks and did not try to be inspiring. He thanked the custodial team by name. He thanked Sean and his crew for making 2-factor authentication boring. He thanked the teachers who had written the rubrics. He thanked the ones who had used them. He mentioned the panel's report and did not apologize for the year. He said gratitude is not a strategy, but it is fuel. When he called Elijah's name, the applause felt like a wave that would let him surf but not drown him. He stood at the podium and did what Asha had advised. He named 5 colleagues who had taken heat for holding a line before anyone cared to notice. Ms. Torres in 9th grade English, who refused to inflate an essay grade because a parent had a printer and a thesaurus. Coach Bell, who benched a starting forward for a week because late work is late work, even if your layup is poetry. Mrs. Reese, who saved her florist receipt when she didn't yet know why. Mr. Chen, who came to a meeting he didn't have to attend and told the room what mastery looks like on paper when you can't see the student. And Ishan, who made sure every suspicious login left a footprint. He asked the room to clap for them and felt the joy of shifting light to where it belonged. He ended the way he had ended 100 classes. "The equation I want on the board this year is the same one you're tired of seeing," he said, smiling. "Integrity plus effort equals success. But here's the amendment I learned this year. Integrity plus effort, multiplied by community, equals change." The room stood the way rooms sometimes do when they decide clapping isn't enough. He left the stage feeling ridiculous and grateful and relieved he could go back to teaching on Monday. The first day of the new year arrived with backpacks that squeaked, shoes that weren't broken in, and a briskness in the hall like the building had been aired out. Elijah wrote his name on the board, and then in smaller letters beneath it, wrote a sentence he'd stolen from Jaya and tuned into a welcome. "This is a room where we will wait while you think." He had learned that expectation is a form of love when it is not weaponized. He led the class through norms that were not about being quiet or still, but about being present and brave and exact. He told them the door was for walking in and the window was for looking out, and neither was for leaving early when thinking got hard. Between second and third period, he stood in the doorway and watched the river of students and thought about the arc that had started with a slammed door and a sentence sharpened like a knife. He remembered the feeling of smooth paper heavy with evidence. He remembered how evidence is colder than the thing it proves. He remembered the day state rankings came out, and he had told the team that 7th is a number and a mirror, and neither defines them. He remembered the first time he told a parent that their child's grade was not a referendum on their parenting, but a description of a moment in time. He didn't know that in 3 weeks, a ninth grader would write him a note that said, "I didn't drop out today because you put my wrong problem on the projector and said it was beautiful." He didn't know that in November, a city council meeting would devolve into a new fight about money, and that he would go home and hold Asha's hand and decide to keep his room fare and let the hallway catch up later. He didn't know that in January, an email would arrive from a university insisting that one of his students belonged in a summer program, and that the student would come to his room and shake the letter like it was a thing you could ring. He did know this. Repair is not a chapter, it is a practice. It is what you do when nobody's looking and when everyone is. It is floors mopped by hands that never get a mic. It is brownies sliced into squares and ingredient lists taped with care. It is a father resigning because conflict of interest isn't just a phrase. It is a shadow you refuse to cast. It is a mother showing up in jeans and doing dishes in the back without a headline. It is a boy with a famous last name writing out every line of a proof as if it were a promise. It is a kid from a bus route learning to say vertex and mean possibility. When the last bell of the day startled the building into movement, Elijah erased the board and left, as always, one sentence up for the custodian to see, because he believed in leaving evidence for the people who keep the room ready. In careful letters he wrote, "Thank you for making this floor shine so our ideas can." Then he turned off the lights, closed the door, and walked into a hallway that was, if not completely fair, at least pointed toward it. What happens when a scholarship doesn't just pay tuition, but asks you to repay it by becoming a kinder, truer version of yourself? September opened with the smell of first rain and the squeak of new sneakers down Riverside's halls. There were new faces, new backpacks, and a different kind of new too. 10 students, the inaugural Merit and Integrity Scholars, each carrying a congratulatory letter and that private fear of breaking something precious. On the board in room 214, Elijah Monroe wrote the promise he wanted to make the whole term. "This is a room where we wait while you think." Beneath it, he sketched a small ladder. Read, try, check, ask, try again, sleep, eat, try. Amir Jackson wore his cheap lanyard that read "Steps Treasurer" like a medal. Between periods, he'd been coaching freshmen to show work instead of grabbing answers, and he was relearning himself in the process. Unlearning the habit of working alone, practicing patience when someone else moves slower. When he leaned over a page, tapped a stray minus sign, and murmured, "The vertex is here, don't miss it," it wasn't just technique. It was how Amir affirmed someone else's effort. Preston Langford carried a new, unbranded backpack with too many pockets, the kind meant for rulers, compasses, and a notebook full of crossed-out attempts. He'd learned to write "given, therefore," like stakes in the ground. There was a particular light in his eyes, the kind you see on someone who's just crossed a makeshift bridge and found solid ground on the far side. That Monday, steps opened 5 minutes early. Denise Jackson arrived with a tray of empanadas she'd bartered for after her shift. Lena wrapped a pencil on the sideboard while sketching the volunteer schedule. Tariq taped up the rules in clear packing tape. Ask to help, don't ask to boast. And then someone no one expected walked in. Genevieve Langford, gray sweater pushed back at the collar, hair twisted up in a hurry, 2 bakery boxes in her hands. She stood in the doorway the way a person stands at the lip of their own exam. Elijah met her halfway, voice even. 3 rules for adults in here. Kids eat first. Wash your hands. No money talk while they ask about math. And if you want to help, you ask, "Do you want help?" And wait for "yes." Genevieve nodded. She set her boxes on the back table and began slicing the bars into perfect squares, as if right angles could be a form of amends. Exactly 12 minutes later, the room decided, healthiest of all, to treat her like useful furniture. Tariq asked about nuts because his little sister carried an EpiPen like a talisman. Genevieve taped an ingredient list to the table without commentary. A ninth grader spilled water and froze. She slid him a stack of paper towels. Press, don't rub, then step back. No applause, no whispers. Repentance works best when it isn't the center of the room. The scholarship committee's work moved in its own steady rhythm. They met in the glass conference room at the public library, an old elm thinking at the window. On the whiteboard, Elijah wrote 3 large words: growth, integrity, need. Charles arrived in a blazer without a tie. Less ceremony, more focus. Denise came in her diner uniform, refusing to spend paid time off on meetings. She was saving it for Nia's field trip. Krupa Patel, a sophomore English teacher who always keeps one front row seat open for early wanderers and sentence talkers, brought a stack of letters. Principal Naomi Hale kept time and tone. Elijah listened for verbs. They cleared the easy files first. A student who crawled from a 2.1 to a 3.6 by learning that showing steps made science easier too. A student whose whenever attendance turned perfect when she learned her kid brother circled her name on the calendar and whispered it like a wish. A student who took over mornings when mom's new shift began at 4 a.m., walked his sister to kindergarten, sprinted to the bus, stayed after for steps, and never said he was hungry because he didn't want a label that stuck. Harder were the edges. A boy with a discipline file like a map of bad days, and a teacher's letter with the opposite of spin. He stopped lying first. Then he stopped leaving. Then he started learning. A 4.0 student with crisp essays and a social worker's note that those numbers can't show what it costs to hold the house together on Friday nights when an uncle drops in with old stories and promises. A boy with a famous last name, a fresh string of honest 88s and 92s, who wrote in a small hand, "I'm not asking because I made a mess. I'm asking because I cleaned mine." Twice Charles felt his old instinct to anoint and stepped back. Denise insisted every recommendation include a one-sentence test. Tell us what they did when no one was watching. When they finished, there were 10 names and 2 alternates, and the same shared feeling. Money, routed along the grooves of dignity, changes the shape of a year without warping the person. The spring awards ceremony used no confetti cannon. Each recipient got a simple slide with a short, specific description that refused to reduce a life to a caption. The audience clapped in the usual places and then in unusual ones, like when a slide for a student named Grace read, Grace learned to say, "Can I show you my steps?" and then showed them again and again until the wrong kind of silence left the room. From the middle rows, James Carter, the original 98, sat with an arm across his mother's shoulders as if to anchor her pride to the seat. He'd chosen MIT in his heart, then pulled the decision back for a week to practice not being swept by momentum. Preston clapped loudly for faces that, 6 months earlier, he might have passed in a grocery aisle without seeing. 3 universities had said yes. He was learning that fear comes in 2 kinds, the kind that makes you run and the kind that makes you run in the right direction. Victoria Mitchell did not attend. She watched the stream from her kitchen, mascara losing a small war with her dish towel. She rewound the slides back to the secret parent, the girl who arrived as if her life depended on it, then opened her calendar and made 3 calls. To the district volunteer office to pack supply boxes for schools with less. To her therapist to say she was tired of the talking phase and ready for the doing one. To Sarah Carter, asking for a quiet conversation at the diner and adding no is an acceptable answer. The independent panel's final session happened in the gym, where folding chairs and echoes conspired to make every voice a plea. Judge Cole read conclusions like a proof. The system had gaps. Power exploited them. Most teachers graded with integrity. Reforms were not a victory lap. They were a baseline. Then she handed the mic to students and sat down like a citizen. Lena described how rubrics changed the language of her team. Tariq told the story of a 9th grader teaching him a new error check and how it felt to be glad, not threatened. Jaya, the freshman who cried after her first full-page solution, spoke without amplification because her voice had its own. "I almost decided in 6th grade that math was where I was supposed to be quiet," she said. "Now I come 3 days a week to a room where people wait while I think." The gym clapped like a wave pushing a boat over a crest. At the brownies and lemonade table, Charles and Elijah clinked paper cups of powdered tartness. There would be noise, Charles said, when donors read the new conflict of interest language. Elijah shrugged. The people offended by that clause are exactly who it's for. Charles laughed, lighter than before. "I wasn't good at brave until recently," Elijah said. "Brave is just honesty plus movement." Summer arrived. Elijah ran his geometry bridge course. More scissors and tape than most math rooms. More string, more walking around. One morning he inverted the usual order and taught proof before names. Pairs of students sorted cards. What must follow from what? A boy silent for 4 days finally blurted, "If that's true and that's true, then this has to be true or nothing works," and looked up like he discovered a wormhole behind the couch. Elijah wrote the sentence on the board, comma, splice and all, then wrote the formal arrowed version beneath it. "Both are math," he said. "One's a map, one's a trailblaze." He meant, you're not visiting from another language. You already speak the thinking. Mid-class, Naomi texted, "Heads up, district will name you to the Integrity and Grading Award Committee and also give you the first one at convocation." Elijah replied, "No." Naomi sent, "Nice try." Asha laughed when he told her. "Take the plaque," she said, and turn the podium into a mirror. Convocation came in the very auditorium where the board meeting once felt like a verdict. The superintendent thanked custodians by name, thanked a T for making two-factor boring, thanked the teachers who built rubrics and the ones who used them. When he called Elijah up, the applause rose like a wave that would carry but not drown him. Elijah did what Asha advised. He used the mic to name 5 other people who had held the line before anyone watched. Ms. Torres, English 9, Coach Bell, Counselor Reese, Mr. Chen, and Ishan. He asked the room to clap for them. Then he ended with the equation everyone could recite in their sleep. Integrity plus effort, success amended at last. Ex-community, change. Opening day, beneath his name, he wrote, "This is a room where we wait while you think." He didn't know that 3 weeks later, a 9th grader would slip a note onto his desk. "I didn't drop out today because you put my wrong problem on the projector and said it was beautiful." He didn't know a November council meeting would flare over money, and he'd go home, hold Asha's hand, and decide to keep his room fair while the hallway caught up. But he knew what mattered. Repair isn't a chapter, it's a practice. Floors shined by hands that never get a mic. Brownies cut into squares with an ingredients list taped beside them. A father resigning because conflict of interest isn't a phrase but a shadow he refuses to cast. A mother showing up in jeans to wash pans. A boy with a big last name writing every line of a proof like a promise. A bus route kid learning to say vertex and hearing possibility in the word. At the end of the day, Elijah left one sentence for the night crew. "Thank you for making this floor shine so our ideas can." Then he switched off the lights, closed the door, and stepped into a hallway that, if not wholly fair, was at least pointed toward it. What do you do when the past knocks and offers you the old light switch you used to flip to avoid seeing yourself? Early October, Preston stood at his locker, holding a white envelope stamped with the crest of a private city club. The sender was Kellen Pierce. Summer pools, night tennis, tests Preston didn't need to worry about. Kellen hadn't crossed the same bridge. Inside, a guest pass and a note in slanted ink. "Tonight, 7 p.m., bar on 2. We need to talk. I've got something you'll want." Preston brought it to room 214, set it on Elijah's desk with a look that was half sheepish, half stubborn. "Should I tear it up or hear him out?" Elijah didn't snatch the envelope. "What do you fear most in each choice?" Preston considered. "If I tear it up, missing out. If I go, falling back." "Then bring someone who can pull you upright if you slip," Elijah said. "Don't go alone." At 6:50 p.m., Preston stepped out of the glass elevator with Amir at his shoulder. They'd agreed on a signal. If the talk turned bad, Amir would tap Preston's shoulder 3 times and they'd both stand. The bar was quiet, leather and low bulbs. Kellen wore a white shirt and the same half smile. "Langford. And Jackson?" He measured the opposition. "Confident." He didn't circle. "My mom still has WAS connections. Unlike your mom, she doesn't do TV." A thin laugh. He pushed a thick envelope across. "Midterm outline for Math 2. Someone grabbed it from the item bank. You're good now, but straight A's will make your file sparkle again. We don't have to work as hard as they do, right?" Amir tapped Preston's shoulder once. Not the signal to leave, the signal that said, "I'm here." Preston looked at the envelope like a mirror of himself 6 months ago, when reputation passed for armor. In his head, he heard Elijah's line, "Classrooms cultivate judgment." Preston breathed. "Kellen, I'm reporting this." Kellen's eyebrows shot up. "To who? Mr. Monroe? Judge Cole?" A scoff. "You think the whole city changed?" "I don't know if the city changed," Preston said quietly. "I know I did." 2 more taps from Amir. They stood. "You'll regret it," Kellen called after them. "Guys like us are born to win." "Where you?" "No," Preston said, turning back. "We're born to learn. Winning is a consequence." Outside, Amir texted the room 215 safety thread with Naomi and Elijah. Minutes later, Naomi called, voice as even as if she'd been practicing all summer. "Thank you. Don't handle any physical evidence. I'll loop in District Security Ishan and the superintendent." Elijah chimed in, "Proud of you both. Sleep. We'll work the rest tomorrow." Morning came with the pass kicking harder. In the Legacy Lions group chat, Preston's old crowd erupted. "Traitor? Your mom's apology enough for you? Who got the clip of you two at the club?" A chopped video cropped up, them sitting, an envelope on the table, then standing. No audio. Enough to start a fire. On the bus, Preston scrolled, hands shaking, the old cocktail of shame, anger, disappearance. Then something new edged in, anger placed correctly. He deleted, then paused. Instead, he opened notes and typed, "Truth doesn't fear videos with the sound off." At school, Naomi had already convened Ishan, the dean, and legal. The internal probe moved fast. An off-contract maintenance worker had scraped a teacher's draft item bank and was selling images. Digital forensics traced the IP, the timestamps, the money. At the staff meeting, Naomi said 3 things plainly. No blaming the victim, the teacher who was breached. No witch hunts, no softness for wrongdoing. The parent notice read like a rubric. Transparent, specific, repair-oriented. That afternoon, the dean hosted "How to Make Multiple Choice Not a State Secret." Question shuffling, diverse banks, tighter access. Ishan's security upgrades became the kind of boring the system needed. In class, Elijah wrote on the board, "Cheating Detection Integrity Education." "Fear rarely fuels transformation," he told them. "Communities do, when they set the right bar and wait while you think." He projected 2 anonymous solutions, one with the right answer but hollow reasoning, one with a wrong answer but rich process. He handed out rubrics and had the class grade them. The consensus was startlingly uniform. The second paper earned more. "You've become the referees we needed," he said, and meant it. Steps was crowded that night. Rumors drive people to rooms with clear rules and free snacks. Genevieve washed trays without a word. Denise taped up a sign. 1 treat if you solved something today, 2 if you didn't, but tried. Lena managed the door, logging visitors so curiosity didn't turn to chaos. Preston sat beside a 10th grader, sweating through trig. "We'll go step by step," he said evenly. "Don't think about 100 points. Think about which expression you can rewrite as sine or cosine now." Kellen didn't vanish. 3 days later, he posted a long status implying Preston's Good Guy Act was about scholarships. The comments were ugly in familiar ways. Preston read them, put his phone down, and wrote a short handwritten letter, 3 paragraphs delivered privately. "I used to be like you. You're trying to sell me what I already paid for at the price of my own trust. I'm not buying it back. No one else saw it. Its power lay in being written." Thursday night, the parent-student-teacher workshop on Red Try Check Ask filled the cafeteria. Elijah set up learning stations, beautiful mistakes, missing steps, right answer, empty thinking, wrong answer, rich thinking. Amir coached a mother-daughter pair through a linear equation with a single rule. Say equals because every time you write, eradicurm. Preston ran change your view, moving parabolas by translating axes so the vertex stood at the origin. Genevieve lingered a long time in front of a wrong but beautiful page, lips pressed like a person practicing the art of looking at a mess without rushing to clean it. On her way out, she slipped a 20 into the jar labeled Snacks for Steps, unsigned. Late one night, Victoria kept her appointment at Sarah's diner. No designer bag, just a paper sack of cookies she'd baked herself. Sarah looked hard at her, then nodded to a booth. Victoria didn't say but. She said, "I'm sorry." 4 times for 4 different things. For the classroom ambush, for doubting fairness, for teaching her son shortcuts, for hurting a boy named Amir she'd never bothered to learn by name. Sarah listened, dish hands anchored on the table. "A good apology," she said, "doesn't force the other person to say, 'I forgive you.' The heavy part comes after." Victoria nodded, exhaling like setting down a bag of sand. Sarah tapped the wall calendar. "Saturday, we're packing supply kits for the D-block apartments. Come, you don't have to say anything." Around the same time, the student council received a 2-sided integrity compact. Not a hollow pledge, but a mutual one. Students promise not to cheat. Teachers promise transparent grading. The school promises fair discipline. Tariq added a line for everyone to complete. "What I'll do when I see a friend drift." The sticky note wall in the foyer filled. "DM them. Don't drag them. Return the answer key if I find it. Remember, I've been wrong too." A week later, Naomi announced the results of the test bank probe. The contractor was charged. 2 students who'd purchased materials were suspended and enrolled in LearnBack, a coached sequence on how to actually learn. Elijah volunteered a session called Proving a Mistake, requiring them to rewrite their full reasoning and mark the empty places. The hour wasn't pleasant, but when it ended, one boy mumbled, "I feel smarter for admitting I lost." Elijah said, "That's the sign you're winning." Akram. By midterm, Preston's grades weren't perfect, 94, 91, and 88 on an essay. He taped the 3 numbers to the corner of his desk like boarding passes for a new trip. Amir posted a 97 in math and an 89 in physics after a sign error. He drew a goofy smiley beside the minus as a reminder to check the middle, not just the ends. And steps stayed full, not because snacks were good, but because the room kept its promise. We'll wait while you think. What holds when the story loses its headlines and the room is just a room again? By late October, campaign signs staked into damp lawns leaned like tired sentries, and Riverside's story had mostly fallen off the city's front page. Judge Cole moved on to another district's audit. The news vans went back to fires, inaugurations, and scheduling segments about pies. You could mistake the quiet for peace if you hadn't lived inside the noise. Elijah didn't mistake it. Quiet, he'd learned, is when work either deepens or drifts. Midterms came and went with fewer theatrics than anyone expected. The district's new item bank protocols held. Multiple versions, shuffled stems, a rule that nothing lived in one place long enough to be stolen by a camera phone. Ishan joked that his team had finally achieved their greatest professional dream, becoming invisible. Naomi sent them donuts that said "thank you" in icing like 7th graders had decorated them. Ishan posted a photo and wrote, "The sweetest MFA, making fraud awkward." In room 214, the gradebook rose and fell in honest lines. Elijah made a small ritual of reading the comment field before any numeric field, as if to remind himself what the numbers were trying and failing to say. Caught error at step 3, good self-check. Brave revision, kept the skeleton, rebuilt the muscles. Stopped at the cliff, next time lay planks backward from the answer. The comments worked like breadcrumbs for future selves. Preston left his 3 midterm numbers, 94, 91, 88, taped on his desk corner for a week and then moved them to the inside cover of his notebook, not to hide but to carry. Amir left his check the middle smiley in the margin of every physics assignment until his hands started drawing it at the right moments without thinking. Lena split her time between soccer playoffs and tutoring shifts, discovering she could be both person and bridge without breaking. The week after midterms, an email arrived from the superintendent's office with a subject line that sounded like a win and read like a dare. Pilot expansion proposal, peer tutoring district-wide. The plan outlined funding to replicate steps in 7 schools by spring with a summer target of 14. It was what everyone had said they wanted, equity by replication, repair by scale. Naomi read the PDF, sent a thumbs up, then called Elijah. "Tell me why I hate how happy this makes me." "Because scaling isn't copying," Elijah said. "It's translating. And we don't yet know the language." "I need a document by Friday," she said. How to export steps without exporting us. He laughed. So you want me to write the thing that proves we can't just write the thing? Exactly, Naomi said. And include snacks. I'm not kidding. He wrote nights that week at the dining table. Maya across from him doing calculus review. Asha on the couch with a stack of charts she was annotating for clinic. His draft was less a manual than a set of anchors. Publish the rubric before the work begins. Put students on the payroll of their own learning. Pay them in roles and trust. Put adults in the room but train them to be furniture. Name the rules like you're hanging coat hooks, not writing commandments. Build the habit of equals because. Say no to speed as virtue. Say yes to snacks as signal. This is a human place. He added a single page titled Failure Modes, the danger of turning peer tutoring into detention or charity. The vacuum that appears when the only adult in the room wants to be the protagonist. The vortex of overpraise that confuses kindness with lowering the bar. He wrote a paragraph called The Weight and described the difference between watching a student think and watching a student drown. Weightness, he wrote, is our pedagogy's hinge. On Thursday, he sent the document to Naomi, who forwarded it with her own cover note to the superintendent. Friday morning, the superintendent replied to both. Best memo I've read this year. Also, donuts. Elijah closed his laptop and reached for his coffee. His phone lit with a new email, this one from a district address he didn't recognize. Public comment. Budget hearing next week. Attached was the agenda for Tuesday's board finance meeting. The expansion of peer tutoring would be discussed alongside transportation, HVSE upgrades, and the replacement of aging laptops. There was asterisks and footnotes language about identifying offsets and competing priorities. Elijah felt the familiar pinch at the base of his skull. The story was about to walk into a room with numbers larger than any student's grade. He sent a text to the STEPS group. Board Finance Meeting 6 p.m. Item 4B, Peer Tutoring Expansion. If we want this to survive, we should show up with data and with names that aren't ours. Lena replied first. I'm on snacks and sign-up sheet. Tariq. I've got the wrong but beautiful demo in 3 minutes. Amir. I can speak, or I cannot speak if others need to speak. Preston. I'd like to speak. I want to say out loud what not cheating sounds like. That weekend, Elijah and Asha took a walk through the park with paper cups of coffee as a pretense for moving forward while talking about standing still. You look like the week found your pockets, Asha said. He told her about the budget hearing. She listened the way she had when they were 22 and grading in cafes between bus rides, without adding air, without trying to bend the story to comfort. You already know what to say, she said. You wrote it last night. Just say it where it matters. On Tuesday evening, the auditorium filled with parents who care where buses stop and what the gym roof leaks on, with teachers who care about everything and don't say it that way, with students in hoodies and a few in borrowed blazers. The finance subcommittee wore their most polite faces, the ones that say, we respect you and also please end on time. The CFO went first with a slide deck of deferred maintenance and state funding formulas. The room's attention bent the way attention bends when adults start using acronyms like receipts. Naomi leaned over and whispered to Elijah, you have 3 minutes to sound like a bidet in a fire drill. He snorted, and then his name was called. He hadn't signed up to speak. He'd meant to be support. But Naomi had written him in. You're our furniture, she murmured as he stood. Go be a good chair. He kept it to 90 seconds. The memo's bones, spoken like a person, not a policy. Peer tutoring works when it's more than time on task. It's culture. It's rubrics before work. It's students paid in roles and trust. It's adults who show up and shut up. It's the habit of equals because. It's snacks as one small way of saying a body matters. If we scale it, fund the structure and the time. Don't fund a room with a sign and think you bought the soul. Next came 2 parents, one who talked about how steps kept her son from ghosting his homework, and another who worried aloud that tutoring would become a way to justify larger classes. Naomi responded with class-size numbers and a sentence Elijah loved for its clean honesty. Peer tutoring does not make up for adults we refuse to hire. It does make more of the adults we have. Then Amir. He adjusted the mic down to his height and contained the room with a single sentence. I'm not asking for free help. I'm asking for a place to work harder. He flattened his hands on the lectern. Steps didn't give me answers. It gave me the courage to say my wrong steps out loud. He paused. I live 30 minutes from here by bus. Snacks matter. Not because I can't get food, but because it tells me you thought about me as a person, not just a test score. Preston spoke after. He didn't say Kellen's name. He didn't say club or envelope. He said, I used to think being good at school meant things should be easy for me. Steps taught me that I'm better when things are honest. Some of you know my last name. I'm not asking you to forget it. I'm asking for you to let it mean work, not access. Tariq's demo closed it. He handed the committee two versions of a paper, a right answer with no work and a wrong answer with a thinking trail, and had them circle which deserved more points. He gave them rubrics and a pencil. We grade process here, he said, or we grade luck. The CFO's mouth twitched in a way that meant, against my will, I learned something tonight. The subcommittee thanked them and moved on to laptops that were old enough to vote. Naomi squeezed Elijah's forearm so hard it left a crescent. They didn't learn until Thursday that the line held. The expansion passed with a modest budget and a stern note about ongoing evaluation. Ishan forwarded the resolution to the steps thread and added a gif of a person juggling bowling pins labeled security, snacks, schedules. Elijah exhaled in a way that made Asha look up from her laptop at the clinic break room. She texted, I heard the drop from here. He replied with a photo of the resolution and then put his phone away and stared at the blank corner of his whiteboard until his next class poured in. The next class mattered for a different kind of reason. A new student, Shay, had transferred mid-semester from across town. Her file contained the usual nouns, guardian, schedule, credits. The counselor had scribbled a note on a post-it, smart, defensive, watch the edges of sarcasm. Elijah had learned to treat such notes as weather advisories. Bring a jacket, don't assume rain. Shay claimed the back left desk and watched the room before the room watched her. She didn't take out her notebook for the first 20 minutes. She clocked everything. Who raised hands, who looked down, how long Elijah waited before filling the air. When he put up a problem with 3 brutal steps in the middle and asked the class to narrate where they'd likely die, a few students laughed. Shay's mouth almost smiled. He gave them 5 minutes to solo and then said, Who's got a beautiful wrong for us? Silence. The old kind, brittle with reputation. Then Jaya, sweet, newly dangerous with confidence, lifted her paper. I lost a negative, she said. It ran away and got into the denominator, and now it's hard to catch. The room smiled. Elijah put Jaya's work on the projector. Let's chase it, he said, and they did, learning new words for old mistakes. Sign bleed, denominator sink. 2 days later, Shay lingered after class and said, I hate it when teachers pretend wrong is cute. Same, Elijah said. It's not cute, it's useful. Different thing. She studied him. Useful how? It shows me where your thinking is strong and where a single missing rung drops the whole ladder, he said. It's a structural report, not a personality test. She looked at the board. We never had that. We just had like, you're smart, you're not. I don't grade people, Elijah said. I grade papers. You say that like a spell. It is one, he said. Breaks a curse. She rolled her eyes in a way that meant maybe. The next week she argued with Preston about whether completing the square was worth the hassle when the quadratic formula sat right there. She argued well. She stayed for steps and didn't eat a snack the first 2 days. On the third, she took a brownie and, at the door, turned back to say thank you, not to Elijah, but to Genevieve, who had sliced that batch into squares you could measure a house with. Meanwhile, Kellen found his storm. The contractor was charged and the DA's press release included a set of initials that every club kid recognized. Privilege rarely forgets how to read Ash. Kellen's status updates went private. Preston's group chat quieted to a hum. 2 old friends left. One sent a DM that only said, you were right, and one sent nothing. An old habit of silence, Preston decided not to chase. November, with its chew of gray sky and gratitude lists, brought a different pressure. Fatigue. Elijah's hands ached the way Shoc does when it has been asked to do too much. His patience was a well he kept refilling on purpose. Asha noticed him dropping into the couch with his shoulders up by his ears and started handing him a mug before he could declare himself fine. "You're running a marathon like a series of sprints," she said. "Pick a pace you can forgive yourself for." He scaled back 2 extras he'd added without noticing: an early morning optional problem set session and a lunch break he'd been giving to college rec letters every day of the week. He moved one rec letter block to Saturdays, with Maya as his co-editor for the price of a pizza. She marked cliches with a highlighter and wrote, "Show, don't announce" in the margins, like she'd been waiting all her life to say it. The district's integrity and grading awards ceremony came and went quickly. A morning convocation, a plaque, a stipend check he endorsed directly to the Merit and Integrity Fund because he didn't like the feeling of paid praise. He used the mic to name again the other people: Torres, Bell, Reese, Chen, Ishan, and then read a single line from his memo. "We're not scaling a program, we're scaling a posture." After, in the hallway, a teacher from another school stopped him to say, "I thought posture meant back straight. Now I think it means palms open." On the Friday before Thanksgiving break, Naomi called an emergency staff meeting in the library. The word emergency meant 2/3 of the room came ready for a tornado drill. Instead, it was a spreadsheet. "Enrollment projections," she said. "We're up in January by 67 at the high school. Good problem. Hard problem. We're receiving more transfers from districts that haven't implemented the reforms yet. Expect some students who are very tired of their names being used for other people's politics." She handed out assignments: new peer tutoring sites, an expanded family rubric night with translation in Spanish, Vietnamese, and Amharic, a parent advisory cluster that didn't meet at 2 p.m. on a weekday when only the retired and the rich could attend. "If we mean equity," she said, "we change the hour, not just the hashtag." That weekend, Elijah drafted the new family rubric night outline. He added a station called The Wait, with chairs and a timer, and a trained adult whose only job was to count to 10 silently while the student thought. He added a station called Feed, where the PTA and anyone with a kitchen could explain how snacks get from donations to mouths. He added stories where parents could write the time they were proudest of their child's work, and then, new this year, the time they were proudest of their child's effort when the work went nowhere. At the diner, Sarah and Victoria worked side by side packaging pantry boxes for the D-block apartments. They didn't talk much. They didn't have to. Victoria had learned the new etiquette of repair: do the thing and let the silence be clean. When a box ripped, she taped it without apologizing for the rip or for the tape. Sarah slid her a Sharpie and said, "Write the apartment number bigger." Victoria did. When they finished, Sarah poured her a coffee and sat across like a person content to let a bridge hold without jumping on it to test its strength. December arrived carrying the kind of cold that made people argue about whether the building ever really heated. The radiator in room 214 hissed like an old cat. Elijah wore a sweater vest. Asha said made him look like a professor in a movie. He said he'd take the compliment and the warmth. The first snow fell on a Saturday when the study team had planned a state comp practice. They came anyway, boots stamping, rugs soaked. Lena called the session Frost and Factors. Tariq arrived with a napkin proof of a trig identity he swore came to him while he scraped the windshield. Preston's application season turned real when the Common App screen insisted on final uploads. He wrote about his mother without writing my mother more than twice. He wrote about September without writing scholarship until the last paragraph, and even then as a mirror, not a medal. He wrote one essay that he and Elijah threw away after 10 minutes because it sounded like it was trying to be a boy the admissions office would believe in. He wrote a new one about a moment in steps when he decided not to touch a pencil and instead asked a sophomore, "Tell me where you think it broke," and how the answer in my head turned into the correct answer on paper. Amir wrote one draft about the bus and the aisles of time he found there. He wrote one about the lab where physics jokes land like confetti if you aim them right. He wrote a short supplement about Mr. Monroe that Mr. Monroe never saw because Amir thought it would make both of them embarrassed. He wrote his own teacher recommendation in his head and then made his actual recommenders' jobs easy by handing them a list of his favorite failures and what he learned from each. He signed up to read at the winter assembly and practiced his timing at steps, like a comic working an open mic in a room with brownies. Shay built a reputation the honest way, by arguing math cleanly and by being the first to raise a hand when Elijah said, "Who has a beautiful wrong?" She rolled her eyes less. She started eating the snack first. She wrote on her December exit ticket, "I didn't know I could be good at this and not be a different person." Elijah wrote back, "You were this person. We just met her." The last week of the semester, the roof over the north stairwell leaked. Custodians set out yellow cones that made the hall feel like it was practicing an obstacle course. A rumor blew in about a threatened lawsuit from a parent at another school who didn't like the new grading transparency. Elijah didn't take the bait. He filed it under things that will pass through and said good morning to the parent the next day, as if the lawsuit were an idea that could still be argued into wisdom. On the final day, he erased the board and wrote a sentence he saved for moments when narrative and semester line breaks scattered like chalk dust. The most important step is the next honest one. He left it there for the night crew to see. Walking to his car through snow that wanted to be pretty and then remembered it was slush, he thought about the board meeting and the kid at the mic saying snacks mattered, about the envelope and the shoulder taps, about the memo that somehow turned into a budget line, about the posture hidden inside all of it. He thought about how the story had been loud and then quiet, and how the line didn't know the difference. He put the key in the ignition and smiled when the heater coughed into life like an old friend late to a party. At home, Asha had made soup, the kind with enough garlic to cure the weak. Maya was sprawled on the rug, legs in the air, laptop open to an email that had the word congratulations in the first line. "Decision?" Elijah asked, grinning into his scarf. "Summer program," she said, trying to keep her voice flat and failing. "Not MIT, yet." She bumped his shoulder with her foot. "But I think they'll like the essay where I drag your sweater vests." "I'll allow it," he said, "as long as you include the equation. Integrity plus effort equals success," she sang, then added, "times community equals change," and then, lower, plus snacks. He laughed and kissed the top of her head, then reached for the soup and the remote and the quiet. Winter break would be 10 days of sleep, reading, and letting the story be small. January's enrollment surge would come with new names and old crises. The line would be there for it. He didn't have to check. He knew. Out the window, the city rested in a way that felt earned. Inside, room 214 waited, unlit but not asleep, a square of air in a building that had learned to keep its promises even when the microphones left. And in the quiet, the work deepened. What breaks first when growth arrives faster than the plan, and what keeps it from breaking all the way? Snow held the city in a clean lie for 8 days. Riverside looked tender under it, like a rumor had settled soft on the roofs. Then January arrived with the truth. Slush, gray, and 67 new students. Naomi's enrollment slide had been correct, and then some. Transfers from districts that hadn't adopted the reforms came in clusters. Kids tired of being props in other people's debates. Parents tired of feeling like their homes were report cards. On the first day back, the lobby felt like an airport at 4 a.m. Rolling suitcases replaced by rolling backpacks. Families checking in at a folding table where the registrar had taped, "Welcome, bienvenidos, chao mung, enequane da hina mathu" in thick black marker. Room 214 inhaled the surge and made space the way lungs do. Elijah reassigned seats not by level but by edges, pairing a quiet sophomore who built ideas like brick next to a transfer, who built them like scaffolds. He carved 2 more step sessions into the week, Tuesday and Thursday mornings. 7:30, 8:10. The first day, 6 kids came. The second, 18. By the second week, he had a full house and a line at the door, and Lena had taped up a paper placard. "We will start on time. We will end on time. We will breathe the whole time." Family Rubric night went district-wide. Riverside hosted the pilot, now with translation stations and laminated handouts. At the wait table, parents lowered themselves into chairs, set phone timers, and practiced counting silently while a student worked. More than one adult bit their lip at second 7 and learned that patience is a muscle. At Feed, Denise turned the logistics of snacks into policy. Request form, storage guidelines, allergy protocols, and a sign that read, "Snacks are not charity, they're structure." At Stories, parents wrote on cardstock and pinned their sentences to a clothesline strung across the cafeteria. Proudest of her when she asked for a regrade by showing her work, not her tears. Proudest of him when he returned the answer key he found by the copier. Proudest of me when I didn't finish the problem for my kid. Genevieve stood at feed in a plain blue apron, handing out paper bowls and keeping track of the tongs. She learned not to narrate her presence. She sliced, served, swept, and slipped out before the last round of applause, leaving a stack of folded tablecloths and a note for Elijah that only said, "Inventory complete. Reordered napkins. G." Meanwhile, the STEPS expansion moved from memo to map. 7 schools, 3 high schools, 4 middle, started their own versions. Elijah ran Saturday workshops on Zoom, refusing to call them trainings. He opened with the same line each time: "You can print my handouts. You have to build your trust." Teachers in other zip codes asked about fights, phones, and what to do when nobody shows up. He told them his failure modes before his wins. The first month, he said, my room had snacks and silence. Then a kid with the loudest laugh solved a problem on the doc cam and said, "I finally feel like my brain is making a noise." You can't put that in a budget, but the time that led to it, pay for that. Shay, now more river than rock, volunteered to be a STEPS lead. She wrote a 1-page guide for new tutors that sounded like her. Don't stand over people. Sit side by side. Ask, where did it first feel weird? Not, why didn't you get it? If someone sighs and says, "I'm dumb," say, "You're tired," or "You're stuck," because those are fixable. She tacked the page on the board and walked away before anyone could clap. Kellen's case came to its procedural end, a deferred sentence with community service and a ban from district networks for 2 years. He dropped off the grid, which is another way of saying he stopped letting anyone see him. One afternoon in February, Elijah found Preston in the hallway with a look that said ghost. "He showed up at my mailbox," Preston said quietly, holding a small opened envelope with no note inside. "Just the guest pass from months ago, torn in half." Elijah nodded and didn't ask for a moral. Some endings are just endings. College nights multiplied like sparrows. Elijah set up a corner where seniors could write the shortest possible versions of their essays, 50-word truths. Amir's read, "I learned to check the middle, not just the ends. Now I do that to ideas too." Preston's, "I believed easy was proof. Turns out proof is proof." Lena's, "My favorite position is still midfield. In math, it's also midfield. Passing the problem forward, then back, until our timing is clean." Elijah taped the 50-worders in a line at the top of the wall, a chorus you could read in one breath and keep all day. In late February, a pipe burst in the science wing and turned C Hall into a small river. Custodians arrived with floor squeegees like oars. Naomi came over the intercom with the kind of calm that makes other people brave. "We have a flood, not a fire. Please stay in your rooms unless you are a custodian or a fish." Laughter cracked the moment in half, which is how good leaders control a room, with oxygen. They relocated 2 classes to room 214. Elijah seated the front board and took a side table with his crew. A chemistry teacher named Ms. Baldwin ran a lab using dry beans and string to model polymers. Jaya raised her hand and said, "So if I skip steps in math, it's like breaking the chain in the polymer?" Ms. Baldwin beamed. "Exactly. The material still looks like it's there until it tears where you can't see." During the chaos, a transfer student named Evan, hood up, headphones around his neck, hovered at the door. "You Monroe?" he asked. "I am," Elijah said. "Gonna join that steps thing," Evan muttered, eyes on his shoes. "But I'm not asking for help." "Cool," Elijah said. "We're not giving any unless you ask." Evan's head came up a fraction. "Okay then." He came that Thursday, sat in the back for 10 minutes, then moved forward by inches. First to the end of one table, then to the middle, then beside Amir, who slid his notebook over like it was automatic. Evan's first question was whispered into page lines. "If I do this, do I break the chain?" Amir said, "Let's tug it," and they did. In March, the Merit and Integrity Fund hosted a small dinner for the first cohort and their families in the library's community room. No dais, no speeches longer than 90 seconds. Charles welcomed everyone, voice plain. "Some of you gave us the most precious thing you had this year," he said. "Your effort when it wasn't paying off yet. We noticed." Krupa read 2 letters aloud that had passed Denise's test, times when the writer had seen the student do something when no one was watching. Denise handed out envelopes with book stipends and bus passes. Naomi thanked the custodians who had set up the tables. Elijah stood at the door and shook hands without making each grip a speech. Victoria waited until cleanup to approach Sarah. I have a question, she said, not quite looking up. Shoot, Sarah said, stacking plates. Could I bring Nia to the museum on Saturday? The youth exhibit on patterns, they've got a hands-on tessellation thing. I don't want it to be a thing. She lights up when she talks about shapes. Sarah's pause lasted long enough to be a choice. Pick her up at 10, she said at last. Bring her back for lunch. She likes grilled cheese and a ridiculous amount of pickles. Victoria nodded and didn't ruin the moment by adding anything wise. On Saturday, she learned that tessellations could be a truce between people who used to be sure they were right. By mid-March, the STEPS clones in other schools were sending back dispatches. One principal wrote, "We tried to launch with a big assembly. It flopped. We regrouped, started with 6 kids and a bag of pretzels. We're at 20 now." A middle school teacher wrote, "Our big breakthrough was changing the chairs. Circles make different conversations." Another wrote, "We had a fight. The rule that saved us was the wait. 10 seconds is 1,000 when you're mad." Elijah read every email and answered them with one line. "You're building posture." He meant, keep your palms open. Then came the fire. On a Thursday afternoon in late March, a rumor, lit like a match, passed like a secret, spread that a teacher at a neighboring school had been doxxed after refusing to change a grade. Screenshots flooded group chats, each uglier than the last. By 7th period, Shay slipped into room 214 and said, "They posted her address." Naomi's voice on the intercom carried the weight of all their weather. "Staff, check your email. Students, you may ignore the bell at dismissal if you don't feel safe. We will keep the building open." Elijah stayed. So did half the staff. The gym became a quiet shelter for kids whose shoulders knew when to hunch. The PTA arrived with trays. The district's security team did their dismal work. Naomi posted at the lobby, "You are safe here. No one will be alone." Room 214 filled like a church does for the wrong reasons. Kids unrolled sleeping bags of feeling. Amir set up a snack line without being asked. Preston took door duty with Coach Bell. Shay made a list of people to text rides to and sat on the floor with Evan, who had gone dead-eyed the way boys do when their bodies remember danger before their brains do. Near midnight, Elijah walked the hall with Naomi. "We can't stop people from being cruel in their living rooms," she said. "No," Elijah said. "We can make our rooms real enough that living rooms feel less like courts." She nodded and they kept walking. By morning, the district had called a press conference. Not the kind that feeds stories, the kind that sucks oxygen from ugly ones. The superintendent said 3 sentences about legal action, then 10 about posture. "We will not be bullied out of fairness. We will not make teachers choose between safety and integrity. We will not let rooms like room 214 be the rare rooms." He named other rooms, and for a day the city remembered that most of its schools were not stories. They were places where people waited while you thought. That afternoon, steps opened as usual, as if rituals were protection spells. Genevieve was there with a pan of lemon bars cut into squares and a small card taped to the tray. Ingredients. She handed the knife to Evan and said, "You cut straighter than I do." He did, and the bars looked like a proof. When the building emptied at last, Elijah erased the board down to the ghost of chalk. He left, as always, one sentence for the night crew. "We're tired. Thank you for holding the floor while we rest." Then he went home and slept 12 hours, the kind of sleep a room earns when it survives. In April, college decisions bloomed like cautious crocuses. Amir opened his laptop at the kitchen table while Denise pretended to stir a pot that had already been stirred enough. MIT said yes. So did State. So did 2 places he'd never seen except on the internet. He breathed, sent a screenshot to Elijah with no words, then called Preston, who was in the living room at the Langford house, where Charles had put his phone face down on principle. Stanford said yes. State did too. The school in the state he'd said he'd never live in again said yes with a scholarship that made the room's oxygen shift. They didn't tell each other what they chose that night. They walked the old pact out to the end. They slept on it and woke up less glamorous and more sure. Amir chose MIT, Preston chose Stanford. They met at room 214 before first period and traded acceptance letters like kids trading baseball cards, then put them away and graded a freshman's practice quiz because the freshman was due second period and it's rude to keep someone waiting when they're brave. Spring finally arrived for real, smelling like cut grass and possibility. The last math meet came and went with a relay time that made Tariq punch the air. Family Rubric Night added a new station, Teach Us, where parents showed students a skill they knew and named the steps. A carpenter showed how to read grain. A nurse showed how to prime an IV without bubbles. Sarah taught 4 kids to rebalance a stuck receipt printer. Victoria showed Nia how to fold a box so it holds even when the weight shifts. On a Sunday afternoon in May, Ruth Ellison returned for one more visit, this time unannounced. She sat in the back of room 214 as Elijah ran a review using sentence stems instead of formulas. I know I'm right because if I were wrong, it would look like. After class, she waited until the last student left and said, "You made the room big enough." Elijah laughed, hoping he hadn't just cried. "Big enough for what?" "For the truth to stand without you holding it up," she said. "That's when you know you can leave a place, and it doesn't fall." He didn't say he wasn't ready to leave. He didn't have to. She patted his arm and said, "Leaving isn't always moving." Outside, the field glittered with small pieces of foil left over from a senior prank that had somehow involved streamers and a lesson on wind resistance. Inside, the calendar moved toward June as surely as formulas move toward answers when you don't skip the spine. And so the year turned its last corner, not with a roar this time, but with the click of a door that fit its frame. Who taught whom, and how do you carry the answer past the bell? June put a shine on everything. Locker doors, auditorium seats, the faces of 9th graders who now walked like 10th graders pretending not to be. On a Friday morning, thick with the smell of floor wax and last chances, Elijah wrote the day's opening on the board. What did you learn that you didn't come here to learn? He didn't ask it aloud. He left it up like a quiet dare. Jaya wrote, that asking is a step, not a surrender. Evan wrote, headphones off, Maria Wanshar's math louder. Shay wrote, wrong is not cute, it's useful. Then added smaller, thanks, I guess. Lena wrote, leadership isn't speeches, it's chairs in a circle. Tariq wrote, a napkin is a math tool. Amir wrote, the middle matters. Preston wrote, proof is proof. Elijah left their answers up for the rest of the morning and did the last thing many teachers forget to do. He taught. No free periods of movies, no ceremonial idling. He walked them through a collection of problems that looked scarier than they were, the kind life hands out when you're trying to do something else. He timed their thinking and their waiting separately and showed them the graph of how both improved over the year. He showed them a histogram of where they made mistakes. The spike had moved from the first step to the third, the hallmark of people who've learned to start well and then learned to watch the spine. The last step session of the year broke its own rule and started late because the hallway wouldn't let them through. Kids kept stopping to hug, most of them pretending to hate it. Denise brought a cake with steps. State summer. Life iced across it in wobbly arrows. Genevieve brought cut fruit, neatly cubed and perfectly portioned, a tenderness she trusted more than speeches. Victoria arrived with Nia and put on gloves without looking for permission. Sarah rolled her eyes in a way that had more affection than judgment. Charles leaned on the doorframe and waved at no one in particular. Ishan delivered a small rolling cart of retired laptops for summer bridge kids to borrow. Naomi popped her head in and said, I'm not crying, you're crying, and then did both things anyway and left. The district's spring achievement night came, as it always did, with shaky folding programs and a line of kids who held envelopes like passports. This time the front row was different. The merit and integrity scholars sat together, trading pencils and mints, more excited for the names after theirs than their own. Elijah took the stage only to stand behind others. He handed certificates to tutors and let them hand them to their peers. He read 2 student quotes, Amir's 50-word truth and Preston's, and then set the microphone where it belonged. Amir walked up, exhaled into the mic, and told a story about a minus sign that went missing in October, and how, when he found it in March, it was hiding in a sentence, not an equation. He thanked his mother in 8 words, for the bus and the bread and everything between, and got off the stage before his dignity had to fight his tears. Preston told a smaller story about the sophomore who asked him to just tell me, and how for the first time he didn't. He asked back, where did it feel weird first? He said he used to think leadership meant being fastest. Now he thought it meant noticing first. He said he was going to Stanford because of the people, not the palm trees. He named 2, Amir and a 9th grader named Kofi, who had learned to press instead of rub. Shay read a poem she swore wasn't a poem, a list of the ways rooms can lie, by making silence look like virtue, by making speed look like worth, and the ways rooms can tell the truth, by waiting, by snacks, by equals because. The district handed Elijah a plaque he didn't want, and he held it a respectable amount of time before tucking it under his arm like a folder. He used his moment to say the line one last time, not as a mantra, but as a map. Integrity plus effort equals success. Times community equals change. Tonight you've shown me the exponent is time. Graduation was heat and gowns and the ritual of mispronounced names. The gym hummed like a hive trying not to sting itself. Elijah sat on the stage with the faculty, knees aching in a way that felt like an honest exchange for the view. Kids he'd watched learn the difference between luck and learning, crossing a line they'd earned. The principal read the script with feeling. The valedictorian said something decent about bridges. The superintendent kept it blessedly short. Then after the hats and the scream that all schools know how to hold, there was the drifting. Families drifting to photos, friends drifting to the parking lot, teachers drifting to a private moment where they stop being instructors and become witnesses who don't have to instruct. In a corner near the bleachers, Victoria hugged Preston the way only mothers who learn something the hard way know how to hug, with arms and with apology. She didn't say anything into his ear that would make a good line. She just held him until he tapped her shoulder twice. Their new signal for I'm okay. Let me go be someone. Across the floor, Denise wiped her eyes with a napkin and pretended she had something in them. Amir took 2 pictures, one with her, one with Elijah, both slightly blurry because hands shake when pride is busy. He whispered, "See you in the fall," and Elijah said, "You will," and then, lower, "So will they," glancing at the 9th graders watching in a line. After the crowd thinned, Ruth Ellison found Elijah by the stage stairs. "Ready to talk about next year?" she asked. "Always," he said, which everyone knows means no and yes at the same time. They walked the hallway that led past the trophy case. The old math plaque still hid behind a soccer cup. Elijah caught their reflections in the glass. His sweater vest persisted, Ruth's cane more companion than need. "I'm not leaving," he said to the glass, surprising even himself with how much voice he put into it. "I didn't ask you to," Ruth said. "But if you ever do, remember you built a room, not a career. Rooms can be packed and shipped." He smiled. "The posture travels." "Exactly," she said. "Palms open." Summer arrived with the friendly boredom schools earn. Steps went on hiatus, but the room didn't sleep. The PTA stored box fans in the closet. The custodian oiled the door that had learned to clack when it was asked to hold too much traffic. Sean replaced a projector bulb. Naomi went to 3 graduations in one day and learned how to cry with sunglasses on. Elijah and Asha took a week at a cabin with no Wi-Fi and laughed like amateurs when they realized how often they reached for their phones. They read each other page-long pieces out loud at night. Asha a chapter on chronic care that sounded suspiciously like steps. Elijah a paper about math anxiety that sounded suspiciously like Siri had transcribed his classroom. They hiked a trail that switched back gently and still made their thighs burn. On a ridge, Asha said, "I want to grow old in a place where our work outlives our names." Elijah said, "Then we picked right." In August, Riverside filled again. Boxes labeled steps. Summer loners came back with scuffs and stickers. New names appeared on rosters like seeds you can't yet see. The Merit and Integrity Fund, now in its 2nd year, announced an expanded cohort and a mentorship track. Last year's scholars paired with this year's in a circle that could hold weight. On orientation day, the principal opened in the auditorium with a ritual people had started to expect and finally stopped mocking. "This is a room where we wait while you think," she said, and then added the new half, "and where we think about how waiting feels." A freshman snorted and then stopped when he saw he was the only one. Room 214 looked like it always did the night before school. A clean board, straight desks, a stack of handouts like promise. Elijah set out the first day index cards with their questions. "What should I call you? What do you want me to notice first? When you get stuck, what helps? When you get praised, what kind of words work on you? What are you carrying this year that I can't see?" He put a bowl of pencils by the door with a note. "Take one. Return it when you can. If you can't, return to the work." He turned off the lights and stood in the doorway 1 second longer than usual. the way people do when the room they love is a person too. On the far side of town, a boy in a different school set a brownie on a table and said, "1 if you solved something, 2 if you tried." In another school, a teacher who had never met Elijah waited to the count of 10 and watched a girl breathe her way into an answer. In another, a custodial crew read a thank you sentence on a board and took a picture for the group chat called Floor Heroes. In a small museum, a child folded a box correctly on the first try and didn't look around to see who had noticed. In a diner, Sarah wrote BLT, add pickles in a shorthand that had become a kind of music. In a quiet house, Genevieve made a pan of lemon bars, cut them into squares, and labeled the ingredients without feeling heroic. In an office with no plaque on the door, Charles filled out a donor form and read the conflict of interest clause out loud, smiling like a person who knows what freedom costs. On a bus headed toward a campus that terrified and delighted him, Amir texted Preston a picture of the notebook page he'd saved for years, the first 98, the one with the tremble. "We start over," he wrote. Preston sent back a photo of the corner where his 3 midterm numbers still lived. "Proof travels," he wrote. Elijah lay awake the night before school and did what teachers do when the city sleeps. He counted the chairs, he counted the names, he counted the seconds he would wait, and then finally he stopped counting and trusted the posture he'd helped build to hold what numbers never could. The bell would ring, the door would open, a new voice would ask a question, the old answer would be ready. Integrity plus effort equals success. Times community equals change. Raised to the power of time, carried past the bell. Proof, then promise.